The term Eskimo is a broad term that refers to the Inuit and Yupik peoples who live in the Arctic regions of Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Siberia. While some sources say the term is not offensive in its original meaning, many people in Canada and Greenland consider it to be a pejorative and outdated exonym, preferring to be called by their specific group names like Inuit, Yupik, or Inupiaq. The story of the Inuit and Yupik peoples does not begin in the familiar landscapes of the Arctic, but much farther back in time, on the vast cold plains of late Pleistocene Siberia. Some 25,000 years ago, a genetically distinct population, now identified as the ancient North Siberians, inhabited this region. The archaeological remains from sites like Malta Bure reveal a society of sophisticated mammoth hunters whose genetic legacy would contribute to the peoples who would later cross into the Americas. Yet, they were not the direct ancestors of the Inuit. That distinction belongs to a subsequent group, the ancient Paleo-Siberians, who emerged in northeastern Siberia thousands of years later. It is from this lineage that the great Arctic migrations would spring. Genetic analysis of both ancient and modern populations allows us to trace this specific ancestral line. A pivotal divergence occurred within Siberia, splitting the ancestors of the first Americans, who would go on to populate the continents to the south, from the ancient Paleo-Siberians who remained in the far northeast. This latter group, archaeologically associated with the Dyuktai culture beginning around 14,000 years ago, represents the foundational population for all subsequent Paleo-Eskimo and Inuit Yupik peoples. Their DNA carries the specific haplogroups that would later define the populations of the American Arctic. They were a people uniquely adapted to the mammoth steppe, an extinct ecosystem of immense grasslands that supported vast herds of woolly mammoth, bison, horse, and reindeer. Their survival depended on a highly mobile lifestyle and an ingenious technological toolkit. The hallmark of their culture was the microblade, a small razor-sharp stone flake. Rather than crafting large, single-piece spear points, these hunters would produce dozens of microblades from a single core of stone. They then set these standardized pieces into grooves carved into bone, antler, or ivory handles, creating composite tools of remarkable efficiency and lethality. This technology represented a highly resourceful adaptation, maximizing the utility of scarce high-quality stone. Alongside these composite knives and projectile points, their toolkit included bifacial stone points for lances and specialized engraving tools known as burins, used for working bone and antler. This technological suite, perfected over millennia in the harsh interior of Siberia, equipped them with the skills necessary for the next stage of their journey. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. They were a people culturally and genetically poised on the edge of Asia, prepared by the unforgiving environment of the Ice Age to follow the herds and their own destiny into a new uninhabited land. The migration of the ancient Paleo-Siberians into the Americas was made possible by a profound geological transformation, driven by the last glacial maximum. As vast continental ice sheets, primarily the Laurentide and Cordilleran, expanded across North America, they locked up immense quantities of the world's water. This caused a global or eustatic drop in sea levels by as much as 120 meters below their present-day positions. The shallow seafloor of the Bering Strait was consequently exposed, creating a vast landmass known as Bering. This was not a narrow, icy corridor, but a subcontinent over 1,000 kilometers wide, connecting the Chukotka Peninsula of Siberia with western Alaska. For millennia, Bering served as a viable homeland in its own right, an extension of the mammoth steppe ecosystem. The first human populations to occupy this now submerged world brought with them the cultural and technological adaptations of the Siberian Dyuktai tradition. Genetic evidence strongly supports a theory known as the Beringian standstill hypothesis. This model posits that after separating from their Siberian relatives, The ancestors of the first Americans lived in genetic isolation within the confines of Beringia for several thousand years, perhaps from as early as 23,000 years ago. During this period, the massive ice sheets to the east blocked any further migration southward. This prolonged pause was not merely a waiting period. It was a critical phase of adaptation, during which a unique Beringian population developed, distinct from the peoples of both Asia and the later inhabitants of the Americas. The oldest undisputed archaeological evidence for human presence in eastern Beringia, what is now Alaska, appears around 14,000 years ago. Sites such as Broken Mammoth, Swan Point, and Mead in the Tanana Valley provide definitive proof of settlement. The lithic assemblages found at these locations show a clear continuity with the Siberian Upper Paleolithic, confirming the origin of these first Alaskans. Another critical site, Upward Sun River, revealed the remains of human infants, providing invaluable genetic data that has helped to confirm the complex population dynamics of this period. These early Beringians were highly successful hunters, exploiting the rich megafauna of the steppe tundra, including steppe bison, horse, and mammoth. Their presence marks the successful transfer of a Siberian way of life to a new continent. They were not merely passing through, they had established a durable presence, occupying this lost world for generations before the final melting of the ice sheets would open the routes leading south and ultimately set the stage for the peopling of two continents. As the Pleistocene epoch drew to a close around 11,700 years ago, the world of the first Alaskans underwent a radical transformation. The retreat of the great ice sheets triggered dramatic environmental shifts, causing the submergence of the Beringia land bridge and the demise of the mammoth steppe ecosystem. The megafauna that had sustained the earliest Beringians, such as the woolly mammoth and steppe bison, vanished. In response to this altered reality, a new and distinct cultural complex emerged, known to archaeologists as the Paleo-Arctic tradition. This was not the result of a new migration, but an in situ adaptation by the descendants of Beringia's first inhabitants, representing a successful pivot to the challenges and opportunities of the early Holocene. The technological signature of the Paleo-Arctic tradition is a direct inheritance from their Siberian forebears, but with a renewed emphasis and refinement. The toolkit is defined by a sophisticated microblade and core technology, particularly the use of distinctive wedge-shaped cores for producing small, standardized stone blades. This system provided an exceptionally efficient means of creating sharp cutting edges for composite tools, a crucial advantage in an environment where large, high-quality stone sources were scarce. These microblades were inset into slotted bone, antler, or ivory points to create lethal projectiles for hunting the smaller, faster game that now dominated the landscape, primarily caribou and a surviving species of bison. Other diagnostic artifacts include small, lanceolate bifacial points and a proliferation of burins, sharp engraving tools used to work organic materials into a wide array of necessary equipment. Archaeological sites like Onion Portage on the Kobuk River and Trail Creek Caves on the Seward Peninsula provide clear evidence of this tradition's subsistence strategy. Faunal remains from these locations confirm a heavy reliance on caribou, a species whose migratory patterns would have demanded highly organized, often communal hunting strategies. The Paleo-Arctic people were masters of this new landscape, their settlement patterns reflecting a deep understanding of animal behavior and seasonal resource availability. However, it is crucial to understand their place in the broader genetic story of the Arctic. Ancient DNA has revealed that the people of the Paleo-Arctic tradition, while successful for millennia, were not the direct ancestors of modern Inuit and Yupik peoples. They represent an earlier, distinct population group. Their genetic lineage would largely be replaced by a subsequent migration from Siberia, that of the Paleo-Eskimos, who would bring an even more specialized toolkit and cultural system, ultimately giving rise to the Dorset culture. While the Paleo-Arctic tradition thrived in the interior and northern coasts of Alaska, a fundamentally different cultural adaptation was taking shape to the south. Beginning around 7,500 years ago, a new maritime culture emerged, centered on the Kodiak Archipelago and the adjacent Alaska Peninsula. Known as the Ocean Bay tradition, these people represent a pivotal shift away from the terrestrial hunting focus of their contemporaries and mark the first successful, long-term human occupation of the North Pacific coast. Their arrival signifies a profound technological and economic revolution, as they were the first to systematically unlock the immense bounty of the cold, nutrient-rich coastal waters, establishing a way of life that would persist and evolve for millennia. The most striking feature of the Ocean Bay tradition is its complete departure from the lithic technology that defined earlier Alaskan cultures. The ubiquitous microblade, the hallmark of the Paleoarctic toolkit, is conspicuously absent. In its place, the Ocean Bay people developed a technology based on heavy, often crudely chipped stone tools, and, most significantly, the grinding of slate. They crafted large unifacial and bifacial knives and projectile points from chert and other flaked stones, but their most diagnostic implements were ground slate points and lances. This technique of abrading stone into a desired shape, rather than flaking it, was perfectly suited for creating durable, resharpenable weapons for hunting the large, tough-skinned sea mammals that were the cornerstone of their economy. Early Ocean Bay sites are littered with the remains of sea lions, harbor seals, and porpoises, a clear testament to their maritime prowess. Archaeological investigations at foundational sites, such as Rice Ridge on Kodiak Island, have uncovered the remnants of their coastal settlements. These were not the ephemeral hunting camps of the interior, but substantial, semi-sedentary villages, evidenced by large shell middens, accumulated heaps of discarded shells, bones, and cultural debris that testify to prolonged occupation. These middens are rich archives, preserving a detailed record of their diet, which also included a variety of fish and seabirds. The Ocean Bay people were pioneers, developing the essential watercraft and hunting techniques, such as early forms of the toggle harpoon, that were necessary to exploit this productive marine environment. Their cultural and genetic origins are distinct from the Paleo-Arctic peoples to the north, representing a separate early coastal migration or a long-term, localized adaptation. They are the foundational culture from which the later Alutiiq, Sugpiaq, and Unangan, Alutiiq peoples would ultimately descend, a lineage separate from that of the Inuit and Yupik, who would follow a different path. Around 4,500 years ago, the demographic landscape of the North American Arctic was irrevocably altered by the arrival of a new people and a revolutionary technology. This was not an evolution of existing cultures, but the result of a distinct migration out of northeastern Siberia, introducing a new population that genetically replaced the earlier Paleoarctic inhabitants of the region. This wave of newcomers brought with them a cultural complex known as the Arctic Small Tool Tradition, ASTT. Their appearance marks the beginning of the Paleo-Eskimo sequence, a long and successful chapter in Arctic prehistory that is separate from the lineage of the Thule people who would arrive thousands of years later. The ASTT represents the first human culture to demonstrate the adaptations necessary to colonize the entire breadth of the North American Arctic, from the shores of Alaska to the distant coasts of Greenland. The tradition earns its name from its most defining characteristic, a highly refined and miniaturized stone toolkit that stands in stark contrast to earlier technologies. At the heart of their lithic industry were exceptionally small and finely crafted implements, including tiny microblades struck from prepared cores, distinctive scrapers for processing hides, and, most diagnostically, a variety of specialized burins. These sharp, chisel-like graving tools were essential for the slot and groove technique used to work organic materials like bone, ivory, and antler with surgical precision. This technology enabled the creation of sophisticated composite tools, such as harpoon heads and arrow points, where small, sharp stone-end blades and side blades were inset into durable organic shafts. This system was a masterpiece of efficiency and portability, allowing highly mobile hunting groups to carry the raw materials for a versatile arsenal in a small pouch. Armed with this innovative toolkit, the people of the Arctic small tool tradition undertook one of the most remarkable migrations in human history. Their subsistence strategy was flexible, targeting terrestrial mammals like caribou and muskox, but it was their developing focus on hunting ringed seals along the coasts and on sea ice that proved critical. This adaptation provided a reliable, fat-rich food source that enabled them to push eastward into previously uninhabited territories. Within a few centuries, they had spread across the vast Canadian Arctic archipelago and had reached Greenland, an astonishingly rapid expansion across thousands of kilometers of harsh terrain. Early regional manifestations of this culture are known as the Denbigh Flint Complex in Alaska and Pre-Dorset and Independence 1 in the eastern Arctic. For nearly 2 millennia, these Paleo-Eskimos would be the sole human occupants of this vast, frozen world. The eastward expansion of the Arctic small tool tradition gave rise to a distinct regional variant known as the Pre-Dorset culture, which occupied the vast territories of the Canadian Arctic and Greenland from roughly 4,500 to 2,800 years ago. These Paleo-Eskimos were the true pioneers of this desolate landscape, the first humans to establish a lasting presence in a region previously untouched by human settlement. Their success was not predicated on large populations, but on an extreme degree of mobility and a highly specialized set of adaptations. The archaeological record they left is ephemeral, consisting of small, scattered sites that speak to a life lived in constant motion, dictated by the relentless cycle of the seasons and the migratory patterns of their prey. Their story is one of ultimate resilience, a small founder population spreading thinly across an immense and unforgiving environment. Pre-Dorset settlement patterns reflect their highly mobile, family-based social structure. Habitation sites are typically small, indicating occupations by just one or a few families at a time. Their primary dwellings were lightweight skin tents, likely similar to the later Yupik, which left behind few archaeological traces beyond arrangements of stones used to hold down the tent edges. A characteristic feature of many pre-Dorset sites is a central box-like hearth, or a linear stone arrangement known as a mid-passage, which divided the interior living space and provided warmth from fires fueled by scarce driftwood or animal fat. Sites like Port Refuge on Devon Island and Igloolik in the Fox Basin show repeated short-term occupations, suggesting these groups returned to favoured hunting locations seasonally over many generations. Building a deep traditional knowledge of the land, their subsistence was a finely tuned system of seasonal exploitation. In the winter, they hunted ringed seals at their breathing holes in the sea ice, a dangerous and patient undertaking that provided the essential fats needed for survival. The spring and summer months saw a shift in focus to migratory caribou, muskoxen, Arctic char, and nesting birds. This required a deep understanding of a vast territory, as failure to intersect with these resources at the correct time would have been catastrophic. Their toolkit was a direct continuation of the broader Arctic small tool tradition, featuring an array of burins for working antler and ivory, end scrapers for preparing hides, and small, delicate projectile points. It was this portable and efficient technology that made their nomadic lifestyle possible. For over 1,500 years, the pre-Dorset people thrived in isolation, laying the cultural and adaptive groundwork from which the more elaborate and artistic Dorset culture would eventually emerge. The long period of pre-Dorset stability was not destined to last. Beginning around 300-500 years ago, the Arctic experienced a significant climatic downturn, known as the Neoglacial period. This was not a cataclysmic event, but a sustained, centuries-long cooling trend that fundamentally reshaped the northern world. For the Paleo-Eskimo population spread thinly across the vast expanse from Alaska to Greenland, this environmental shift presented an existential challenge. The relatively stable conditions that had facilitated their initial expansion gave way to a harsher, less predictable reality, characterized by longer, more severe winters, the expansion of sea ice, and a tangible shortening of the already brief summer thaw. This period of climatic stress acted as a powerful selective pressure, forcing a series of crucial technological, economic, and social adaptations that were essential for survival and would ultimately trigger the cultural transition into the subsequent Dorset period. The environmental consequences of the neoglacial cooling were profound and far-reaching. The expansion of multi-year sea ice altered the marine ecosystem, making open water hunting more difficult and restricting access to certain coastal resources. The behavior and distribution of key prey species were directly affected. Ringed seals became even more critical as a winter staple, while the migration routes of caribou may have shifted in response to changes in vegetation and snow cover. The availability of driftwood, an essential resource for fuel and the manufacture of larger tools, likely decreased as sea ice locked up coastlines for longer portions of the year. This scarcity placed a premium on alternative fuel sources and intensified the need for technologies that could maximize heat and light from available materials. The margin for error in this newly refrigerated world shrank dramatically, placing immense pressure on the pre-Dorset people to refine their adaptive strategies. The archaeological record from this transitional period reveals the innovations that arose in response to these pressures. The most significant of these was the development and widespread adoption of the soapstone lamp, or quillic. While rudimentary lamps may have existed earlier, it was during this cooling phase that they became a central and indispensable feature of Arctic life, providing a reliable source of light and warmth through the long, dark winters by burning sea mammal oil. This technological solution to the dual problems of cold and darkness was a prerequisite for long-term survival in the worsening conditions. Concurrently, there was an increased specialization in hunting equipment, with refinements in harpoon technology geared specifically toward the demands of breathing hole sealing on the expansive sea ice. These adaptations were not merely about survival, they were the crucible in which a new, more specialized Arctic culture was forged, one that was perfectly attuned to life in a colder world. At the absolute northernmost limit of the Paleo-Eskimo expansion, a distinct and remarkably hardy culture known as Independence I emerged in the extreme high Arctic of Greenland around 4,400 years ago. Occupying the ice-free but forbiddingly desolate region of Pearyland, they represent the furthest reach of the initial Arctic small-tool tradition migration. Their existence at the edge of the habitable world was sustained by a hyper-specialized subsistence strategy that differed significantly from their pre-Dorset relatives to the south. In these high latitudes, where fjords were often choked with ice year-round, the primary and most reliable prey was not the seal, but the muskox. The archaeological assemblages of Independence I sites are dominated by the remains of these large terrestrial mammals, supplemented by Arctic hare, fox, and migratory birds during the brief, intensely sunlit summer. The material culture of the Independence I people is a testament to extreme efficiency in a resource-scarce environment. Their stone toolkits, while clearly part of the aesthete, possess a distinctive elegance, with delicately crafted burins and finely serrated projectile points. Perhaps their most characteristic architectural feature is the mid-passage hearth, a stone-lined axial feature in their skin-tent dwellings that conserved precious fuel, likely willow twigs and animal fat, by concentrating heat. The discovery of minuscule eyed bone needles provides direct evidence for the production of sophisticated, tailored skin clothing, an absolute necessity for surviving the profound cold. The archaeological signature they left is incredibly faint. Small clusters of tent rings and scattered artifacts speak to a tiny, highly mobile population living in a state of constant energy conservation, leaving behind only ghostly traces on the landscape. This remarkable adaptation, however, proved unsustainable. Around 3,800 years ago, as the neoglacial cooling intensified, the Independence I culture vanished. The delicate ecological balance that had permitted their survival was broken, and the high Arctic was likely abandoned by humans for nearly a millennium. It was not until around 2,800 years ago that people returned to this region. This second wave of pioneers, known as the Independence II culture, was not a direct continuation of the first. Their toolkit and settlement patterns show clear affiliations with the emerging Dorset culture to the south, representing a distinct recolonization event. While they shared a similar subsistence focus on muskox, their technology, including the presence of microblades and certain harpoon types, was different. Their tenure was also precarious, and by about 2,400 years ago, they too disappeared, leaving the high Arctic empty once more, a recurring testament to the marginal and ephemeral nature of human life at the top of the world. Contemporaneous with the hyper-specialized Independence I culture of the high Arctic, a related but distinct Paleo-Eskimo group known as the Sakuk flourished along the more resource-rich western and southeastern coasts of Greenland. From approximately 4,500 to 2,800 years ago, the Sakuk people developed a remarkably successful and long-lasting adaptation to a subarctic environment that was significantly more productive than the desolate landscapes of Peary-land. Their cultural endurance and distinctive technological advancements set them apart from their contemporaries, representing a different and highly successful solution to the challenges of Arctic life. Analysis of their extensive archaeological remains has provided one of the most detailed pictures of any Paleo-Eskimo society, revealing a people with a diverse economy, innovative hunting methods, and a genetic history that has revolutionized our understanding of the continent's first Arctic inhabitants. The subsistence strategy of the Sakuk was notably more varied than that of their northern cousins, a direct reflection of the richer marine ecosystems of the Davis Strait. While ringed seals remained a crucial staple, archaeological evidence from sites like Chekatassusuk shows that their diet was incredibly broad, encompassing harp seals, harbour seals, and even small whales. This maritime focus was supplemented by the systematic hunting of caribou, a wide array of seabirds, and Arctic fox. This economic diversity allowed for larger and more semi-permanent settlements than those found in the high Arctic. Sakuk sites often reveal more substantial tent dwellings, extensive midden deposits, and a greater density of artifacts, suggesting that communities could remain in one location for longer periods, exploiting the seasonal abundance of their territory. Technologically, the Sakuk are distinguished by a pivotal innovation, the bow and arrow. While other Paleo-Eskimo groups relied on thrusting spears and harpoons, the Sakuk developed sophisticated archery equipment. This is confirmed by the discovery of numerous, small, finely chipped projectile points, clearly identifiable as arrowheads, as well as preserved fragments of wooden bows. This technology would have provided a significant advantage, particularly in the hunting of caribou, allowing for greater accuracy and a safer distance from their prey. Their toolkit was otherwise a refined expression of the Arctic small tool tradition, featuring an abundance of burins for working organic materials and well-made scrapers for hide preparation. Perhaps the most profound insight into the Sakuk comes from modern genetics. The sequencing of the first ancient human genome was accomplished using a 4,000-year-old hair sample from a Sakuk man, found preserved in the permafrost. The results were revolutionary, demonstrating that this individual and by extension the Sakuk people were not directly related to the modern Inuit of Greenland. Instead, their genetic lineage traced back to northeastern Siberia, confirming they were part of an earlier, separate migration into the Americas that ultimately vanished, leaving no descendants in the modern gene pool. This ghostly genetic echo confirms their status as a truly ancient and distinct people who successfully colonized one of the world's harshest environments for over a millennium before their culture faded into the archaeological record. Emerging directly from the crucible of the neoglacial period, the Dorset culture represents the full maturation of the Paleo-Eskimo adaptation to a colder, harsher Arctic. Flourishing from approximately 2,800 to as recently as 600 years ago, they were the direct inheritors of the pre-Dorset legacy, mastering the challenges of the cooled world with a unique and sophisticated cultural toolkit. Known in later Inuit oral traditions as the Tuniat, a people often described as shy but immensely strong, The Dorset left behind an archaeological record of profound complexity and artistic brilliance that continues to fascinate researchers. Their society was one of paradoxes. They achieved a level of artistic expression unmatched in the circumpolar north, yet they lacked key technologies that were present in both earlier and later cultures, a fact that speaks to a highly specialized and ultimately divergent evolutionary path. The Dorset economy was a finely tuned engine of survival, centered almost exclusively on the sea ice. They perfected the art of breathing hole sealing, developing a wide array of specialized self-blading harpoon heads that were masterpieces of flint knapping. This intense specialization is reflected in their settlement patterns, which show a more sedentary winter lifestyle than their ancestors. The Dorset constructed well-insulated, semi-subterranean winter houses, often framed with stone and sod, which allowed them to inhabit specific, resource-rich coastal locations for extended periods. The presence of these more substantial dwellings, sometimes taking the form of longhouses, indicates a shift towards a more communally organized existence during the long, dark months. However, this mastery came with a curious set of technological absences. The Dorset people did not use the bow and arrow, a technology known to the earlier Sakak, nor did they possess dog sleds or mechanical drills, both of which would be hallmarks of the Thule people who succeeded them. This unique technological profile is overshadowed by their extraordinary artistic and spiritual life. The Dorset are renowned for their powerful and enigmatic miniature carvings, meticulously crafted from walrus ivory, bone, wood, and antler. This was not art for decoration, but a window into a rich, shamanistic world. They produced thousands of naturalistic carvings of animals, especially polar bears in various poses, standing, walking, or swimming, which likely served as hunting amulets. More striking are the carvings of human figures, often depicted with transformative features or wearing masks that suggest shamanic rituals and spirit journeys. Fantastical beings, such as flying bears and human-animal hybrids, populate their artistic repertoire alongside hauntingly hollow-eyed masks that may have been used in ceremonies. This intense focus on a portable, spiritually charged art, combined with their specialized ice hunting technology and unique cultural absences, defines the Dorset as a distinct and deeply mysterious final chapter in the long history of the Paleo-Eskimo peoples. While the Dorset culture represented the final, highly specialized expression of the ancient Paleo-Eskimo lineage, a profoundly different and technologically dynamic society was taking shape on the coast of northern Alaska. This was the Benurk culture, which appeared around 1,500 years ago and acted as the immediate forerunner and developmental stage for the expansive Thule tradition. The Benurk were not an evolution of the Dorset. They were the product of a new cultural and likely demographic wave from the Siberian side of the Bering Strait, bringing with them a sophisticated maritime toolkit that would fundamentally re-engineer the relationship between humans and the Arctic Ocean. Their emergence marks the beginning of the Neo-Eskimo period, a turning point that would ultimately lead to the disappearance of the Tuniat. The Benurk adaptation was centered not just on the sea ice, but on the open water, and specifically on the pursuit of the largest and most calorie-rich prey in the Arctic, the bowhead whale. This required a revolutionary suite of technologies. Central to their success was the development of large open-skin boats, the Umiak, which could carry entire crews of whalers into the dangerous offshore leads. These vessels, combined with smaller and more agile kayaks, gave them an unprecedented command of the marine environment. To hunt these giant mammals, they perfected the toggling harpoon, a device with a detachable head connected to a line and floats. This design ensured that the harpoon head would pivot and lock under the whale's blubber, preventing escape and allowing the hunters to exhaust their massive prey. This focus on whaling had profound social implications. A successful whale hunt required the coordinated effort of dozens of individuals, fostering a more complex and hierarchical social structure than the small family groups typical of the Dorset. The distribution of the enormous bounty from a single whale tons of meat, muktuk, and oil necessitated established community leaders and sharing customs that reinforced social cohesion in larger, more permanent villages. Their settlements, found at strategic coastal points like Point Barrow, consisted of substantial semi-subterranean houses, their roofs often supported by whale jawbones and driftwood, a clear indicator of a more sedentary and resource-rich existence. The Bernurk material culture also shows a distinct departure from Paleo-Eskimo traditions. While they were skilled flint knappers, they made extensive use of polished slate for tools like the ulu, a woman's knife, and projectile points, a material choice that was both durable and efficient. Their pottery was a simple, thick-walled ware, used for cooking and oil storage. Their artistic expression was also unique, characterized by bold, curvilinear geometric designs incised onto ivory and bone tools, a style with clear roots in the old Bering Sea cultures of Siberia, and starkly different from the naturalistic shamanistic art of the Dorset. It was this powerful combination of open water technology, large game hunting capability, and complex social organization, all forged in the crucible of the Alaskan coast, that created the blueprint for the subsequent Thule expansion that would sweep across the Arctic. The foundation of the Neo-Eskimo ascendancy was a technological and social system engineered for a single, monumental purpose: the systematic hunting of the bowhead whale. This was not merely an advancement in subsistence, it was a revolution that redefined the limits of human enterprise in the Arctic. At the heart of this complex was a specific suite of interconnected tools and social roles that allowed for the consistent harvesting of the ocean's largest mammals, providing an economic base of unprecedented scale and reliability. This whaling package was the engine that powered the Bernurk and subsequent Thule cultures, giving them a decisive advantage over all predecessors. The primary instrument of this revolution was the umiak, a vessel of remarkable design and utility. Ranging up to 40 feet in length, these large open boats were constructed from a frame of driftwood, or, where wood was scarce, whalebone, ingeniously lashed together. This frame was then covered by the stitched-together hides of walrus or large bearded seals, a task meticulously undertaken by the women of the community, whose skill in sewing waterproof seams was essential to the boat's integrity. Capable of carrying a crew of 8 to 10 whalers plus their extensive gear, the umiak was not a coastal skiff but a seaworthy vessel, able to venture far into the treacherous, ice-choked leads in pursuit of migrating bowheads. Its combination of size, durability, and relative lightness made it the perfect platform for open-water whaling. Success, however, depended on more than just the boat. The critical innovation was the toggling harpoon head integrated into a sophisticated drag float system. The harpooner's weapon was attached to a long, heavy line of walrus hide, which in turn was connected to a series of inflated sealskin floats. The purpose of these floats was not to anchor the whale, an impossible task given the animal's immense power, but to create tremendous hydrodynamic drag. Once struck, a bowhead attempting to dive or flee would be forced to pull these buoyant, resistant floats through the water. This relentless opposition prevented the whale from sounding to the crushing depths and rapidly sapped its energy. The system was a masterpiece of physics, turning the whale's own strength against it until it was exhausted and could be dispatched with killing lances. The entire operation was directed by the umialik, the boat captain and hunt leader, a position of great prestige earned through skill, experience, and the ability to command a crew. The successful butchering and distribution of the whale's enormous resources, tons of meat, muktuk, oil, and baleen, further reinforced these complex social structures. This complete technological and social package, centered on the umiak and the drag float system, provided a caloric return so immense that it fundamentally altered the carrying capacity of the Arctic coastline, creating the surplus and stability necessary for the demographic expansion that was to come. The rapid expansion of the Neo-Eskimo peoples was driven by a triad of technological innovations that, when combined, conferred an unprecedented mastery over the Arctic environment. This suite of tools, refined during the Bernurk phase, included the dog sled, the kayak, and the perfected toggling harpoon. These were not merely improvements on existing implements, but represented a paradigm shift in transportation, personal hunting capability, and the efficiency of securing large prey. Together, they formed an integrated system that unlocked new levels of mobility and resource extraction, enabling the Thule culture to thrive in and ultimately dominate every biome the Arctic had to offer. For overland and sea ice travel, the dog sled was a revolutionary development. It was a masterpiece of engineering designed for flexibility and durability, constructed with runners of wood or whalebone, sometimes shoed with polished ice for reduced friction, and held together with a complex system of baleen or hide lashings. This construction allowed the sled to absorb the shocks of travel over rough, uneven ice. Harnessed in a fan formation, teams of powerful, specially bred dogs could pull heavy loads of meat, gear, and household goods over vast distances. This technology fundamentally altered the scale of human movement, facilitating long-distance trade, seasonal migrations between hunting grounds, and the transport of entire family groups, a logistical capability the Dorset never possessed. In the water, the kayak provided the individual hunter with a level of speed, stealth, and seaworthiness previously unattainable. As a personal watercraft, it was the perfect counterpart to the large, crew-operated umiak. Built on a light, ingeniously designed frame of driftwood covered in a taut, waterproof sealskin, the kayak was a low-profile, closed-deck vessel that made the hunter an extension of the craft itself. Propelled by a double-bladed paddle, it was exceptionally fast and maneuverable, allowing hunters to silently approach seals and walrus at their breathing holes or haul-outs. It was also indispensable for hunting caribou as they crossed rivers and lakes during their migrations, a context where the umiak would have been too slow and conspicuous. The effectiveness of both watercraft was amplified by the highly evolved toggling harpoon head. This device was a marvel of mechanical efficiency. The sharp point, made of stone or ivory, was designed for initial penetration, but its true genius lay in its construction. The head was designed to detach from the harpoon shaft upon impact. As the wounded animal attempted to flee, the tension on the attached line would cause the harpoon head to pivot 90 degrees under the skin and blubber, locking it securely in place like a toggle. This mechanism made escape virtually impossible and was vastly superior to simple barbed harpoons, which could be dislodged. This technological trinity sled, kayak, and toggling harpoon formed a synergistic toolkit that gave the Thule a decisive and overwhelming advantage in the hunt for Arctic resources. The technological suite of the Neo-Eskimo peoples was the engine for their expansion, but the highway on which they travelled was the sea itself. Their rapid dispersal across the North American Arctic was not an overland trek, but one of the world's great maritime migrations, a testament to an unparalleled mastery of Arctic seafaring. This was a fundamentally different approach to mobility than that of their predecessors. It involved not just the movement of individual hunters, but the translocation of entire communities, families, dogs, and material culture across vast and hazardous stretches of ocean. This capability was the logistical key to their continent-spanning success. A critical enabling factor for this great migration was a climatic shift known as the medieval warm period, a phase of relatively warmer temperatures that peaked between the 10th and 13th centuries. For the Arctic, this meant a significant reduction in the extent and persistence of multi-year sea ice. The Northwest Passage and other channels through the complex Canadian archipelago became more navigable, with longer ice-free seasons creating open-water corridors that had been impassable for centuries. This climatic window of opportunity did not cause the migration, but it made the Thule's technologically driven expansion possible on a scale and at a speed that would have been unthinkable in a colder, ice-choked era. Their seafaring system relied on a symbiotic pairing of vessels. The umiak served as the primary transport craft, a veritable Arctic cargo ship. Piled high with tents, tools, food supplies, and even dogs, it was the vessel that moved the heart of the community. Paddled primarily by women, it was the stable, high-capacity platform that ensured the group's material foundation could be moved from one location to the next. Ranging ahead and alongside the Umiaks were the kayaks, piloted by the male hunters. In this migratory context, their role shifted from solitary stalking to that of scouts and protectors for the flotilla. They hunted for seals and other game to provision the traveling group, explored promising coastlines for the next encampment, and provided a rapid response defense against marine threats like aggressive walrus or polar bears. Navigating these passages required a profound body of traditional ecological knowledge. Thule mariners navigated without charts or compasses, relying instead on an intimate understanding of coastal topography, currents, and prevailing winds. They read the sky, interpreting the water sky, the dark reflection of open water on the cloud base, to find routes through the ice pack. They understood the migration patterns of birds and marine mammals as indicators of direction and resource availability. This was not simply hugging the coast. It was a series of calculated open water voyages between strategic headlands and islands, a systematic and confident conquest of the Arctic seascape that allowed them to populate a continent in a matter of generations. With their maritime capabilities established and their technological toolkit perfected, the Thule people embarked on one of the most rapid and extensive human migrations in history. Beginning around 1000 AD from a homeland on the North Alaskan coast, they exploded eastward across the North American Arctic. This was not a gradual diffusion of culture or a slow trickle of people. It was a demographic wave of advance, a swift and systematic colonization of an entire continent's northern rim. In the span of just a few generations, a period of perhaps 2 to 3 centuries, their settlements stretched from the Bering Strait to the shores of Greenland, a distance of over 5,000 kilometers. This unprecedented speed stands in stark contrast to the millennia it took their Paleo-Eskimo predecessors to cover the same territory. The archaeological record tracks this expansion with remarkable clarity. The material signature of the Thule culture, including distinctive toggling harpoon heads for whaling, the ulu or woman's knife for butchering, and the characteristic semi-subterranean sod houses framed with whalebone, appears in a clear chronological sequence from west to east. The earliest Thule sites, radiocarbon dated to the 11th century, are found in the Amundsen and Coronation Gulf regions of the central Canadian Arctic. By the 12th century, their presence is firmly established on the islands of the high Arctic, such as Devon and Ellesmere Island. By the 13th century, Thule pioneers had crossed the Davis Strait and established their first settlements along the coasts of Greenland. This rapid dispersal is best understood through a wave of advance model. The migration was not a single coordinated mass movement, but a process of continual budding off at the frontier. A small pioneering group, likely a few extended families in their Umiaks, would travel eastward until they found a prime, unoccupied whaling location, a bay or strait, with a reliable seasonal migration of bowheads. They would establish a new settlement, and as their population grew, a younger generation would form a new splinter group to repeat the process, leapfrogging further east. This method allowed for an extremely rapid expansion, as the pioneers were always moving into virgin territory rich with the marine mammal resources their entire economy was built to exploit. The primary impetus for this relentless eastward push was the pursuit of the bowhead whale. The warmer conditions of the medieval warm period had opened new migration routes for these massive animals through the channels of the Canadian archipelago. The Thule people, possessing the only technology capable of systematically hunting them, simply followed this critical resource. Their migration was a direct, strategic exploitation of a newly available economic niche. In doing so, they moved into a landscape already inhabited by the Dorset people, setting the stage for one of the most profound cultural encounters in Arctic history. The eastward expansion of the Thule people was not an advance into an uninhabited void. For thousands of years, the eastern Arctic had been the exclusive domain of the Paleo-Eskimo peoples, culminating in the artistically rich and highly specialized Dorset culture. The arrival of the Thule around the 11th and 12th centuries initiated a period of cultural contact that resulted not in assimilation or synthesis, but in one of the most complete and enigmatic population replacements in human history. Within a few centuries of the Thule's arrival, the Dorset people, the last of the Tuniat, vanished from the archaeological and genetic record, leaving behind only their distinctive artifacts and faint echoes in Inuit oral tradition. The encounter was defined by a profound technological and economic asymmetry. The Dorset were a highly adapted pedestrian culture, masters of life on the sea ice. Their subsistence focused on hunting seals and walrus at their breathing holes, a patient and skilled endeavour. However, their toolkit, while refined, lacked several key innovations. Crucially, they did not possess the bow and arrow, limiting their effectiveness in hunting caribou. They had no dog sleds for long-distance overland transport, and most importantly, they lacked the large open-water umiak and the associated whaling technology. Their world, while spiritually and artistically complex, was logistically constrained. In contrast, the Thule arrived with a multifaceted and overwhelmingly effective subsistence system. Their technological triad of dog sleds, kayaks, and umiaks gave them unparalleled mobility on ice, in open water, and for community transport. Their mastery of bowhead whaling provided a resource base of immense caloric value, allowing them to support larger, more permanent settlements with greater population densities. This ability to harvest the largest animals in the ecosystem gave them a decisive economic and demographic advantage that the Dorset could not match. Archaeological evidence for the interaction is subtle and points away from a narrative of widespread violent conquest. There is a conspicuous lack of fortified sites or mass graves showing evidence of warfare. In many regions, Thule and late Dorset sites appear to exist sequentially, with Thule settlements often occupying the most resource-abundant locations, such as prime whaling bays. This suggests a process of competitive exclusion, where the incoming Thule simply took over the best territories, forcing the Dorset into more marginal, less productive areas where their population could no longer be sustained. This model is strongly supported by genetic studies of both ancient remains and modern Inuit populations. The data shows a stark genetic discontinuity. Modern Inuit are descended almost entirely from the Thule migrants, with virtually no detectable genetic input from the Paleo-Eskimo peoples they replaced. This lack of admixture indicates that little to no intermarriage occurred. The Dorset were not absorbed, they were replaced. This outcome was likely the result of demographic swamping. The Thule, with a more secure and abundant food source, sustained higher birth rates and lower mortality, allowing their population to grow and expand, while the displaced Dorset population declined into extinction. The success of the Thule migration and their ability to sustain larger populations in the Arctic rested on a sophisticated and dualistic architectural strategy. Their primary dwelling for the long winter was the semi-subterranean sod house, known in various dialects as a karmat. This was a permanent, labor-intensive structure engineered for maximum thermal efficiency. Construction began with the excavation of a pit, often 2 meters deep, harnessing the stable geothermal warmth of the earth as a primary insulator against the extreme sub-zero air temperatures. The framework of this dwelling was a marvel of resourcefulness, using the largest materials available in a treeless environment. The massive mandibles, ribs, and skulls of bowhead whales, supplemented with driftwood logs when available. This robust skeleton was then covered with a thick layer of sod blocks, carefully cut and stacked to create walls and a roof that provided immense insulation. The interior was designed around heat retention. A long, partially submerged entrance tunnel acted as a cold trap, ensuring that cold air settled in the tunnel and did not directly enter the main living chamber. The primary living space was dominated by a large, raised sleeping platform, often paved with flat stones and covered in warm caribou hides and muskox skins. This elevated position kept the inhabitants above the coldest air, which pooled on the floor. Light and, crucially, heat were provided by one or more soapstone lamps, or cudlick, which burned seal or whale oil with a moss wick. These lamps were the thermal heart of the home, providing a consistent, low-intensity heat that could raise the interior temperature by 20 degrees Celsius or more compared to the outside, all while consuming fuel at a slow, efficient rate. For mobility during winter hunting expeditions away from the main settlement, the Thule employed their second architectural masterpiece, the igluviarak, or snow house. Far from a permanent home, the igloo was a temporary shelter, a lightweight and brilliantly engineered solution to survival on the trail. Its construction depended on a specific type of snow, dense, wind-packed snow known as pukak, which could be cut into solid blocks with a snow knife or panna. The structure was not a simple hemisphere but a catenary arch, built in a continuous, inward-leaning spiral. This design distributed the weight of the blocks perfectly, creating a self-supporting dome that grew stronger as the snow settled and sintered. A well-built igloo was so strong a person could stand on its roof. A clear block of lake ice or a piece of stretched seal intestine served as a window, and a ventilation hole at the top prevented the buildup of carbon dioxide, while the low-set entrance again acted as a cold trap. The genius of the igloo was its ability to turn the occupant's own body heat and the warmth of a single lamp into an asset. This warmth would slightly melt the interior surface, which would then refreeze into a glaze of ice, sealing the structure and making it airtight and even more insulative. The Thule culture's dominance of the Arctic was fueled by a powerful and efficient economic engine, one based on the systematic surplus harvesting of marine mammals. While their technology ensured survival, it was their ability to generate a surplus that allowed their society to flourish and engage with the wider world. The foundation of this economy was the bowhead whale, a single successful hunt of which provided a caloric and material windfall unparalleled in the Arctic. Tons of meat and blubber, or muktak, provided food security and the critical oil that fueled the soapstone lamps for heat and light. Beyond this immediate subsistence, the whale provided the raw materials for a robust manufacturing and trade economy. Its bones formed the very framework of their winter homes, while the long, flexible plates of baleen from its mouth were a form of natural plastic used for making everything from composite bows and sled runners to buckets and nets. This capacity for surplus production drove the development of extensive and sophisticated trade networks that connected the Thule people to cultures thousands of kilometers away. They were not an isolated people. They were active participants in a circumpolar system of exchange. From their heartland, they exported high-value goods that were rare or unobtainable in other regions. The most significant of these was walrus and narwhal ivory. Walrus tusks, in particular, were a form of Arctic gold, highly prized in both Asia and Europe for carving and ornamentation. Along with ivory, they traded baleen, polar bear hides, and fine-quality sealskins. In return, they imported materials that were critically absent from their own environment. Most importantly, metal. Archaeological analysis of Thule sites reveals a consistent presence of iron, sourced from multiple directions. From the west, across the Bering Strait, came smelted iron from Siberian or Chinese origins, traded through intermediary groups. From the south, they acquired native copper from subarctic Dane peoples. Most remarkably, in the eastern Arctic, the Thule engaged in direct trade with the Norse colonists of Greenland. Thule archaeological sites in Greenland and the Canadian High Arctic contain Norse artifacts, including iron rivets, knife blades, chainmail, and bronze pot fragments. Conversely, Norse farmstead sites have yielded Thule-related items, confirming the exchange of Arctic goods, likely ivory and furs, for European metal. These trade routes were not random but followed established corridors, with certain locations like Cape Krusenstern in Alaska serving as major seasonal aggregation points where different groups would meet to trade, socialize, and form alliances. This economic system was not based on currency, but on complex, long-term partnerships of reciprocal exchange. The ability to acquire essential non-local materials like metal and wood was fundamental to the resilience and technological superiority of the Thule, allowing their culture to dominate the Arctic for centuries. The rapid Thule migration across the Arctic was not a continuous nomadic drift, but a deliberate process of colonization and homeland creation. As Thule pioneers moved into the vast and complex waterways of the Canadian Arctic archipelago, they systematically identified and occupied key strategic locations, transforming the region into a network of permanent and semi-permanent settlements. This was a process of landscape learning and profound adaptation, where the successful Alaskan maritime hunting template was meticulously applied to a new and varied environment. The selection of settlement sites was non-random and highly strategic, dictated by a deep understanding of animal ecology and geography. Prime locations were typically situated at the nexus of multiple resource zones, offering access to different species at different times of the year. Archaeological surveys reveal a consistent pattern. Major winter villages were established in sheltered bays with deep water access, necessary for bowhead whale migration and hunting. Sites like those found on Somerset Island, in the Cumberland Sound of Baffin Island, and along the coast of Hudson Bay showed dense concentrations of large, well-constructed whalebone houses, indicating long-term, repeated occupation by substantial communities. These core settlements served as hubs from which smaller, more specialized satellite camps could be established for seasonal activities. For instance, camps would be positioned near reliable flow edges for winter seal hunting, adjacent to major river estuaries for Arctic char runs, or inland along caribou migration corridors. The material culture within these new settlements demonstrates a clear continuity with the Alaskan Thule heartland, but with distinct regional adaptations. The toolkits remained broadly similar, but the specific raw materials used began to reflect local geology. The chert from northern Alaska was replaced by locally sourced slate, quartzite, and nephrite for the production of blades and adzes. While the economic focus remained on marine mammals, the relative importance of different species shifted based on local abundance. In areas where bowhead whales were less common, the economy diversified, with a greater emphasis on walrus, narwhal, and various species of seal. This flexibility was crucial to the long-term success of the colonization effort. The social fabric of these new homelands was organized around the hunting crew, and, in particular, the whaling captain or Umialik. The immense labor and coordination required for a successful whale hunt solidified the Umialik's position as a community leader, whose responsibilities extended to the distribution of meat and the organization of communal activities. This created stable social hierarchies within the villages, providing the organizational structure necessary for sustained occupation. The archaeological record at sites like Bruman Point on Bathurst Island shows evidence of this permanence, with vast, stratified middens full of animal bones, discarded tools, and house repair debris, accumulating over centuries of continuous habitation, cementing the Thule's transformation of the archipelago into an ancestral Inuit homeland. By the 13th century, the Thule expansion reached its ultimate eastern terminus, a two-pronged final push into Labrador and across the Davis Strait to Greenland. This was not a tentative exploration, but a swift and confident colonization of the last uninhabited Arctic lands, driven by the same maritime technology and economic system that had carried them across the continent. The arrival in Greenland is marked archaeologically by what is known as the Ruin Island phase. This phase is characterized by a distinct toolkit, including specific types of winged harpoon heads and decorative motifs that show strong, direct connections to the Punuk and Birnuk cultures of the Bering Strait. This has led many archaeologists to theorize that the Greenlandic colonization was the result of a final, rapid, long-distance migration pulse, a group of pioneers who leapfrogged existing Thule settlements in the central Arctic to reach the rich hunting grounds of the Far East. Upon arriving in Greenland, the Thule people found an environment of unparalleled maritime abundance. The West Greenland current created polynyas and open water leads that were teeming with life. The vast colonies of harp seals, ringed seals, and the rich walrus populations of Disco Bay provided a resource base that could support large, stable communities. Thule winter villages quickly sprang up along the coast, replicating the successful semi-subterranean sod house model, with archaeological sites from the Thule district southward to the Nuuk region showing evidence of intensive, long-term occupation. It was here, in this new homeland, that the Thule people encountered another group of colonists, the Norse. Initial contact, evidenced by the presence of Norse artifacts in Thule sites and vice versa, was likely sporadic and centered on trade, with the Thule exchanging valuable walrus ivory and furs for European metal. Simultaneously, other Thule groups pushed southward from the Hudson Strait, colonizing the northern coast of Labrador. This expansion brought them into a subarctic environment for the first time, a landscape that included boreal forests. The arrival in Labrador is documented at sites like Saglek Bay, where classic Thule winter houses have been excavated. This new environment necessitated economic adjustments. While maritime mammal hunting remained central, the availability of wood for the first time in generations was a significant development, altering fuel sources and construction techniques. Furthermore, in Labrador, the Thule people came into direct contact and competition with existing subarctic indigenous groups, the ancestors of the Inuit. This southern frontier was not an empty land, but a contested one, marking a different dynamic of colonization than their arrival in the uninhabited high Arctic and setting the stage for new cultural interactions and conflicts. Beginning around the 14th century, a significant global climatic shift, known as the Little Ice Age, initiated a period of profound transformation across the Arctic. For the Thule people, this was not a gradual cooling, but a fundamental restructuring of their environment, marked by longer, colder winters, shorter and cooler summers, and, most critically, a dramatic expansion in the extent and thickness of sea ice. The predictable open water seasons that had facilitated the Great Migration and supported the bowhead whale economy began to shrink. Waterways that were once reliable whale migration routes became choked with multi-year pack ice, making the large-scale open-boat whaling that underpinned their society increasingly difficult and, in many regions of the Central Arctic, completely unviable. This environmental change triggered the end of the classic Thule cultural pattern and forced a period of intense adaptation and regionalization. The decline of large-scale whaling precipitated a wholesale economic and social reorganization. The immense surplus provided by a single bowhead whale could no longer be relied upon, forcing a shift towards a more diversified and localized subsistence strategy. The primary focus moved to smaller, more predictable resources, chief among them the ringed seal. This necessitated a change in hunting techniques, away from the communal effort of the Umiak crew to the patient, individual skill of the breathing hole hunter. The technique, known as molik, required a hunter to wait motionless for hours in extreme cold over a single seal breathing hole, a testament to a new emphasis on individual endurance over collective force. This economic shift is clearly visible in the archaeological record, which shows a decline in the large, heavy whaling harpoon heads and a corresponding increase in lighter sealing harpoons. Specialized ice testing tools and indicators made of feather or down to detect a seal's breath. Settlement patterns changed accordingly. The large, permanent winter villages composed of dozens of semi-subterranean sod and whalebone houses were largely abandoned. Instead, populations fragmented into smaller, more mobile family groups that could disperse across the landscape to exploit scattered resources. The snow house, or igloo, which had been a temporary travel shelter for the Thule, became the primary winter dwelling for many groups in the Central Arctic, its brilliant engineering providing a mobile and resource-efficient solution to the need for shelter. This period of climatic stress was the crucible in which the historically known Inuit societies were forged. The once relatively uniform Pan-Arctic Thule culture diverged into distinct regional groups, such as the Copper Inuit, the Netzilik, and the Iglulik, each with unique technological, social, and dialectal traits shaped by their successful adaptation to the new, colder realities of the Little Ice Age. The social restructuring that followed the climatic shift of the Little Ice Age was as profound as the economic one. With the abandonment of large, centralized villages, the intricate web of kinship became the primary organizing principle of society, a flexible and resilient framework perfectly suited to a life of mobility and dispersed settlement. The fundamental unit of both production and consumption became the nuclear family, but this was merely the core of a much larger and more critical network of mutual obligation. Survival depended on the extended family, or illegiate, a bilateral kindred that traced relationships through both matrilineal and patrilineal lines. This system maximized the number of relatives an individual could call upon for aid, creating a crucial social safety net in an environment of high risk and unpredictable resources. Within this framework, sharing was not simply a moral virtue but the central economic mechanism. Formal leadership as it existed in more sedentary societies was absent. There were no hereditary chiefs or councils with coercive authority. Instead, influence was situational and earned through demonstrated skill, wisdom, and generosity. An individual known as an isumatak, or one who thinks, would emerge as a respected leader whose advice was sought on matters of group movement or hunting strategy. This leadership was fluid. An expert caribou hunter might lead an inland hunt, while a skilled sealing specialist would take precedence during the winter camp. Authority was granted by consensus and could be withdrawn if a leader's judgment proved poor or if they failed to share generously. This decentralized and meritocratic system provided the flexibility needed for small mobile groups to make effective life or death decisions without a rigid political hierarchy. To further expand the social safety net beyond the bounds of blood and marriage, Inuit societies developed a series of formal partnerships that created kin-like bonds between unrelated individuals. Seal-sharing partnerships, for example, established formal agreements between hunting partners to divide the catch according to specific rules, ensuring that a hunter's family would receive food even if he was unsuccessful. Another critical institution was the spouse exchange partnership, which created powerful alliances between families, granting mutual access to resources and aid across vast geographical distances. In the absence of formal laws, social order was maintained through community pressure, gossip, and ritualized practices like the song duel, where grievances were aired publicly through satirical and often humorous songs, allowing for the resolution of conflict without violence. This complex system of kinship and partnerships was the essential social technology that ensured cooperation and resilience in a world defined by ice and family. Life in the post-Thula Arctic was governed by a meticulously orchestrated annual cycle, a nomadic rhythm of movement and subsistence precisely synchronized with the migrations of animals and the profound shifts of the seasons. This was not aimless wandering, but a highly structured pattern of land use based on generations of accumulated environmental knowledge. The year began with the spring thaw, a period of transition and opportunity. As the sea ice began to fracture, families would abandon their winter sealing camps and move to coastal locations to intercept the returning flocks of migratory waterfowl and to collect their eggs from nesting colonies, providing a vital influx of fresh food. This was also the time for hunting basking seals, known as utsuk, as they hauled out onto the melting ice floes, a less arduous method of hunting that yielded crucial stores of meat and blubber. As summer arrived, bringing 24-hour daylight, many groups moved inland. This season was dominated by the pursuit of caribou, the single most important terrestrial resource. Hunters employed sophisticated cooperative strategies, constructing complex stone drive lanes, or inuksut, to channel the migrating herds towards ambushes or into lakes where they could be easily dispatched from kayaks. The summer was a time of relative abundance, supplemented by fishing for Arctic char at stone weirs, or saputit, which were built across rivers to trap the fish during their annual runs. This period of plenty often allowed for the largest social aggregations of the year, where dispersed family groups would come together to trade, celebrate, and arrange marriages. Autumn was a season of intense and urgent preparation for the coming winter. The focus returned to the caribou, as their southward migration offered a final opportunity to secure large quantities of meat that would be dried or frozen in stone caches for the winter. Just as importantly, the caribou hides procured in early autumn, before the hair became too thick and brittle, were essential for crafting the vital insulated winter clothing. Every part of the animal was utilized, from the sinew for thread to the antlers for tools. As the days shortened and the first snows fell, groups would complete their food caching and begin the move back towards the coast, preparing for the formation of the sea ice. Winter demanded a return to the coast and a consolidation into camps established on the newly formed stable sea ice. Survival through the dark months depended on the combination of food stores gathered in the autumn and the highly specialized technique of breathing hole sealing. This demanding hunt provided the staple of fresh meat and the all-important blubber for fuel, which was burned in soapstone lamps to provide both light and heat within the snow houses. The winter camp, though a time of hardship, was also the primary season for social life, where tool manufacturing, the repair of equipment, and the sharing of stories and myths reinforced the cultural and kinship bonds essential for survival. Survival in the Arctic was predicated on a level of zoological and environmental knowledge so intimate that it constituted a distinct science, transmitted orally and through direct experience across generations. This was not a matter of luck, but of precise, calculated action based on a profound understanding of the prey. For the caribou, the hunt was a study in applied behavioral ecology. Hunters possessed a detailed mental map of migration corridors, calving grounds, and seasonal grazing areas, but their knowledge went deeper. They understood how wind direction influenced herd movement, allowing them to approach undetected. They recognized the subtle signs of a herd's passage, the age of tracks, the nature of browse marks on vegetation that indicated its size, speed, and condition. The water crossing hunt was a masterpiece of tactical exploitation. Hunters knew that caribou were at their most vulnerable in the water, their antlers impeding their swimming, and positioned their kayaks for maximum effect. This required not only paddling skill, but a precise understanding of river currents and the exact locations where herds were most likely to cross. The pursuit of marine mammals demanded an entirely different but equally sophisticated body of knowledge. Breathing hole sealing was an act of extreme patience, founded on an expert understanding of ice dynamics and seal physiology. A hunter had to be able to identify an active breathing hole, often buried under layers of wind-packed snow, by signs as subtle as a minuscule vapor hole or a slight discoloration of the snow. They understood the rhythm of a ringed seal's breathing and diving patterns, knowing precisely when to strike with the harpoon. The spring hunt for basking seals required knowledge of their preferred haul-out locations and an almost supernatural ability to mimic a seal's own movements, inching across the ice to get within striking range. The walrus hunt represented the pinnacle of communal effort and courage, a high-stakes endeavor targeting an animal of immense power and dangerous temperament. Success depended on a deep understanding of walrus social behavior, including the specific tidal conditions and ice formations they favored for their haul-out sites. Hunters in Inumiaq had to approach the herd silently, coordinating their paddling to avoid alarming the sentinels. The harpooner, or atkuku, had to strike a precise point behind the animal's massive skull to secure the harpoon head. The crew's subsequent actions were a perfectly choreographed response to the chaos that followed, managing the line and the inflated sealskin drag float to wear down the powerful animal without getting the boat crushed or overturned by the enraged and defensive herd. This was not merely hunting, it was a complex interplay of biology, physics, and strategy, an intellectual and physical mastery of the animal world that made life possible. The single most critical technology for survival in the post-Thule Arctic was not a tool or a weapon, but the clothing itself a sophisticated, multi-component system of insulation engineered with a level of technical precision born from millennia of trial and error. This was the art of warmth, a domain of material science and masterful tailoring that made human life possible in the coldest habitable places on Earth. The primary material, and the one upon which this entire system was based, was the hide of the barren ground caribou. No other natural material possessed its unique combination of lightness and insulating capacity. This effectiveness was due to the structure of the caribou hair itself. Each hair is hollow, trapping a pocket of air, and the hide consists of a dense, woolly underfur beneath a layer of longer, thicker guard hairs. The result was a material that provided unparalleled thermal resistance for its weight, a crucial factor for a mobile people. The genius of the system lay in its double-layered design. For the coldest conditions, 2 full suits were worn. The inner suit was tailored with the fur turned inward against the skin, creating a layer of soft, insulating air directly on the body. The outer suit, or parka, was worn with the fur facing outward, providing a windproof and snow-shedding shell. This 2-layer principle created a highly effective vapor management system. The inner layer wicking moisture away from the skin, and the air trapped between the 2 layers allowed this perspiration to travel outward and freeze on the exterior of the inner garment, away from the body, preventing the fatal chilling effect of frozen sweat. The design was ingeniously ventilated, with a large fur-ruffed hood, loose cuffs, and an untucked parka bottom, allowing the wearer to regulate their temperature and vent excess moisture by adjusting openings, a critical feature during strenuous activity like hunting. Construction of these garments was the exclusive and highly respected domain of women, and their skill was a direct measure of their family's chances of survival. This was not simple sewing, it was precision tailoring. Garments were custom-fitted to the individual to ensure mobility while minimizing heat loss. Using fine, sharp needles crafted from bird bone or ivory, and thread made from braided caribou sinew, seamstresses created incredibly strong, tight seams. Sinew thread had the unique property of swelling when it became wet, which made the seams of waterproof garments, like boots, self-sealing. The iconic boots, or kamek, were a marvel of composite material engineering, often utilizing waterproof, durable bearded sealskin for the sole, tough caribou leg skin for the upper portions, and softer skins for the insulating liners. A hunter's life depended entirely on the quality of his wife's sewing. A single poorly stitched seam could lead to frostbite and ultimately starvation. The Inuit and Yupik worldview was one in which the physical and spiritual realms were not separate, but deeply interwoven, a landscape animated by a universe of unseen forces and entities. Navigating this complex reality was the specialized and perilous work of the shaman, known in the eastern Arctic as the Angakuk. This individual was not a priest who led public worship, but a spiritual technician, a mediator who could traverse the veils between worlds to diagnose misfortune, heal the sick, and negotiate with the powerful non-human beings who controlled the fortunes of the hunt. Their authority was not inherited, but earned through a grueling apprenticeship, often involving prolonged isolation, fasting, and terrifying visionary encounters through which they acquired the control of helping spirits, or tuangate. These spirits, often those of powerful animals like bears or walruses, became the Angakuku's tools, allowing them to journey in a trance state to the land of the dead, the bottom of the sea, or the realm of the moon. The core of their practice was to maintain balance. Illness was often diagnosed as soul loss, where a person's spiritual essence had been stolen by a malevolent force, requiring the Angakuk to undertake a spirit flight to retrieve it. A lack of game was not seen as a simple ecological fluctuation, but as a direct consequence of broken taboos angering a key spiritual controller, most notably the powerful sea woman, known by various names such as Sedna or Nuliajuk. When the community had violated hunting prescriptions, she would hold back the sea mammals in her hair at the bottom of the ocean. It was the Angakuku's duty to journey to her, ritually comb her hair, and appease her to release the animals, thereby restoring the hunt. This was a transaction, a negotiation to rectify a spiritual imbalance that had manifested as physical starvation. Public seances, often held in a darkened snow house, were the primary venue for this work. Accompanied by the hypnotic rhythm of a caribou skin drum and powerful esoteric chants, the Angakuku would enter a trance. The community would witness tangible evidence of the spirit realm's proximity, strange voices, objects moving, and the shaman's own voice appearing to come from far away. They might perform specific acts of divination, like kilanek, or head lifting, to answer a specific question. The shaman's power was entirely pragmatic and results-based. Their status depended on their proven ability to produce tangible outcomes. A successful Angakok brought back seals, cured the sick, and predicted the weather. One who failed repeatedly would lose all credibility, their whispers on the wind fading into irrelevance. The relationship between the hunter and the hunted was governed by a cosmology fundamentally different from one of human dominion over nature. It was a system of reciprocal obligation. The core belief was that animals were not simply taken, but willingly gave themselves to the hunter who demonstrated proper respect. This respect was codified in a complex legalistic framework of taboos, and the ultimate arbiter of this covenant, for all sea mammals, was the powerful and feared figure of the sea woman, often known as Sedna. She was not a benevolent goddess to be worshipped, but the formidable guardian of the ocean's creatures, the mistress of the deep, whose appeasement was a matter of life and death. Her power stemmed from her control over the souls of the seals, walruses, and whales, who were believed to originate from her body, specifically from her severed fingers in most versions of her origin myth. This entire spiritual ecosystem was predicated on the concept that every animal possessed a soul, or inua, which would be reborn into a new body if its former vessel was treated correctly. The hunt was therefore a temporary loan, and the hunter's actions after the kill determined whether the animal's soul would choose to return. A specific set of rituals was required to honor the soul of a freshly killed seal. Upon bringing it into the home, it was offered a drink of fresh, clean water, a gesture of hospitality to a spirit that had spent its life in the salt water of the ocean. This act was believed to please the soul and ensure its reincarnation, thus guaranteeing the future of the hunt for the entire community. The system of taboos, or pitelinik, was intricate and absolute, forming the structural law of this spiritual contract. The most fundamental of these was the strict separation of products from the land and the sea. One could not hunt caribou and seal in the same season, nor could one work on caribou skins inside a snow house on the sea ice. Butchering a whale required a unique set of tools that could not be used for other animals. Failure to observe these rules, whether intentional or accidental, created a form of spiritual pollution. This pollution was believed to physically drift downwards, accumulating as filth and tangles in Sedna's hair at the bottom of the sea. This caused her immense pain and anger, and in her rage, she would withhold the animals from the hunters, leading directly to starvation. The hunt's success was therefore not a matter of ecological chance, but a direct reflection of the community's moral and ritual purity. In a world without written language, the primary technology for the storage, retrieval, and transmission of information was the human memory, organized and made durable through the power of oral tradition. This was not a system of casual folk tales, but a highly structured and disciplined intellectual practice, a living library that contained the cumulative knowledge of millennia. Storytelling, particularly during the long, dark winters, was the central institution of education, law, and science. Through narratives passed from one generation to the next, a vast and complex dataset was preserved, encoding everything from precise navigational charts to complex legal precedents and social histories. The accuracy of this information was a matter of survival, and the role of the storyteller, the keeper of these traditions, was one of immense responsibility and prestige. These oral archives contained highly practical, empirical knowledge essential for navigating and exploiting the Arctic environment. Stories about the travels of ancestral heroes were not mere fables, they were detailed geographical maps. The narrative would encode the specific sequence of islands, the location of treacherous currents, the safest passages through sea ice, and the landmarks indicating a hidden harbour or a critical resource like a soapstone quarry. Place names themselves often contained vital information about the resources or dangers found there. Similarly, detailed genealogies, meticulously memorized and publicly recited, functioned as legal charters defining an individual's identity, their kinship obligations, and their rights to specific hunting territories. This was a system where history and law were one and the same, validated through communal memory. The traditions also preserved the historical record with remarkable fidelity. The Inuit narratives describing the Tuniat, the shy giants who preceded them in the land, provided a detailed folk history of the Dorset people, a memory that persisted for nearly 1,000 years before being confirmed by modern archaeology. The myths, such as the Epic of the Sea Woman, served as theological and legal texts, explaining the origin and absolute necessity of the intricate system of taboos that governed the human-animal relationship. These stories were not entertainment. They were the foundational documents of the society, explaining why the world was the way it was and how one must behave to survive within it. The performance of these stories reinforced social cohesion and ensured that every member of the community understood the laws that bound them together and to the spiritual world. The central instrument of public life and ceremony was the shallow, single-headed frame drum, known as the kilaut. Typically constructed from a ring of driftwood or whalebone over which a caribou or walrus stomach membrane was stretched taut, this was not solely a musical device, but a powerful social and legal tool. The drum dance, held within a specially constructed large snow house, the kagik, was the primary institution for community gathering during the winter months. It was here that news was shared, alliances were forged, and most importantly, social tensions were managed and resolved. The performances were not abstract concerts. They were the embodiment of law, history, and personal experience, made public and given weight through the powerful combination of rhythm, song, and movement. One of the most critical functions of the drum dance was its role as a judicial forum through the institution of the song duel, or ivilingwak. In a society without formal courts or written laws, this was the primary mechanism for resolving non-fatal disputes, from the theft of property to accusations of adultery. Two opponents would face each other in the center of the kagik, and in turn, each would perform a song they had composed specifically for the occasion. These were not simple insults, but meticulously crafted legal arguments, using satire, wit, and mockery to sway public opinion. The performer would drum and dance while singing, sometimes physically striking their opponent on the side of the head, with the edge of the drum as a form of ritualized, non-lethal combat. The winner was not decided by a formal verdict, but by the audience's reaction. The person who could make their opponent look the most ridiculous, who garnered the most laughter and approval, was deemed to have won the case. This system effectively resolved conflict and restored social harmony without resorting to the kind of violence that could fracture a small, interdependent community. Beyond its legal function, the drum dance was the heart of ceremony and celebration. Songs, or pisit, were considered personal property. A great hunter would compose songs to recount his most harrowing or successful expeditions, encoding precise details of the event into the lyrics. These were personal histories, performed to validate one's status and share knowledge with the community. The dances celebrated the changing of the seasons, the successful conclusion of a whale hunt, or the arrival of visitors. They were a nexus of social life, a way to reaffirm the bonds of kinship and community in the isolating darkness of the Arctic winter, all mediated through the resonant, hypnotic beat of the drum. The artistic production of the Thule people was an intimate and powerful expression of their worldview, rendered in miniature from the organic materials that defined their existence. The primary media were walrus ivory, caribou antler, and the dense bones of sea mammals, materials valued not only for their durability, but for their inherent connection to the animals that sustained human life. Wood was exceedingly scarce, reserved for essential structural uses, making bone and ivory the foundation of both technology and aesthetic expression. The art was fundamentally portable, a practical necessity for a semi-nomadic people. It manifested not in large static monuments, but in small personal objects, amulets, needle cases, combs, and intricate decorations on the functional surfaces of hunting tools. This was not art for display in the modern sense. It was a deeply integrated component of everyday life and spiritual practice. The distinction between a tool and a work of art was largely non-existent. The efficacy of a harpoon head, for example, was believed to be enhanced by its aesthetic and spiritual correctness. Carvers used stone burins and adzes to incise elegant and precise designs onto the surfaces of these objects. A common motif was the schematic human figure, often depicted in a state of transformation or with skeletal features visible, a style archaeologists refer to as the X-ray perspective. These were not portraits of individuals, but representations of human spirits, ancestral beings, or the Angakuku in a state of trance. The art was a technology for interacting with the non-empirical world, a way to make the abstract forces of the cosmos tangible and manageable. Animal figures were pervasive, particularly those of the key species in their subsistence economy: seals, walruses, whales, and polar bears. These miniature effigies, often carved with a remarkable degree of naturalism that revealed an intimate anatomical knowledge, were not simply decorative. They functioned as powerful hunting charms. A carving of a swimming bear was not a mere depiction. It was an embodiment of the bear's spirit and strength, a portable vessel of power that could be carried by a hunter to ensure success and protection. Similarly, stylized carvings of birds, especially waterfowl, were common, often decorating tools used in the summer hunt. The act of carving was an act of creation, imbuing an object with a spirit and a specific function in the complex negotiations between the human and animal worlds. The art was a visual prayer, a form of sympathetic magic etched into the very tools of survival. The artistic legacy of the Dorset culture represents a profound departure from the traditions that preceded and followed it, constituting a self-contained world of intense spiritual expression. Unlike the Thule, who integrated art into the surfaces of their tools, Dorset art existed as a distinct category of objects, rarely appearing as decoration on functional implements. Created from driftwood, walrus tusk, and caribou antler, these were not tools embellished with art, but artifacts whose primary function was aesthetic and spiritual. This corpus of miniature sculpture provides the most direct insight into the complex cosmology of the people known to the Inuit as the Tuniat. The carvings are characterized by a unique and often haunting style, where the human form is frequently elongated, abstracted, and charged with supernatural meaning. Central to this artistic world were the tiny, exquisitely detailed human effigies and masquettes. These were not portraits, but archetypes, often carved with an unsettling minimalism that emphasizes their otherworldly nature. Many figures are depicted without clear gender, their limbs attenuated, and their faces either blank or captured in a trance-like expression. A defining feature of Dorset art is the miniature mask, or masquette, some no larger than a thumbnail. Far too small to be worn on a human face, archaeological evidence suggests they were attached to clothing or shamanistic paraphernalia, perhaps representing the faces of spirits encountered during a trance or serving as portals for spiritual vision. Some carvings depict individuals wearing these masks, confirming their role in ritual practice. The theme of shamanism is the unequivocal core of Dorset artistic expression. A significant number of carvings depict therianthropic transformations, figures caught in the act of morphing between human and animal form, particularly the polar bear. The famous shaman's tunic, a driftwood carving of a human figure wrapped in the skin of a bear, is a literal depiction of this spiritual metamorphosis. Another recurring and enigmatic object is the flying or floating shaman, a recumbent figure often carved from ivory, sometimes with a hollowed-out chest cavity that may have held a magical substance or a representation of the soul. These artifacts are widely interpreted as physical representations of the shaman's soul flight, the ecstatic out-of-body journey to the spirit world. Animal carvings, especially of the polar bear, were imbued with immense power. Dorset artists captured the essence of the animal's movement and spirit, with a blend of naturalism and abstraction. A carving was not just an image of a bear, it was a vessel for the bear's spirit, or inua. The frequent depiction of skeletal patterns on these figures was not a simple artistic convention, but a representation of the shaman's ability to see beyond the physical form to the spiritual essence within. This haunting, spiritually saturated art is the primary surviving testament to the inner world of the Dorset people, a record of their beliefs carved in bone and ivory. Inuit and Yupik societies operated under a complex and effective legal system entirely devoid of written codes, courts, or formal enforcement bodies. The law, known in various dialects as Maligate or Pikiate, was a body of unwritten customary rules and ethical principles transmitted orally across generations. Its paramount objective was not punishment, but the maintenance of social harmony and group survival. In an environment where cooperation was a non-negotiable condition of existence, the most serious crimes were those that threatened the cohesion and stability of the community. Justice was therefore fundamentally restorative, aimed at mending the social fabric rather than simply penalizing an offender. The primary mechanisms of enforcement were informal yet immensely powerful, relying on public opinion and the deep-seated need for acceptance within a small, interdependent group. Social control began with subtle but pervasive tools. Gossip, public ridicule, and social shaming were highly effective in regulating behavior. An individual's reputation as a skilled provider and a cooperative member of the group was their single most valuable asset. To lose it was to face a form of social death that could be as devastating as physical exile. For most transgressions, from laziness to minor theft, the threat of being ostracized was a sufficient deterrent. When direct disputes arose, they were often mediated by a respected community leader, or isumatak literally, one who thinks. This was not an official position of power, but a status earned through wisdom, hunting prowess, and demonstrated good judgment. The isumatak did not issue verdicts. Instead, they facilitated a resolution through consensus, guiding the disputing parties toward an outcome that the entire community could accept. The most severe offenses were those that directly jeopardized the group's survival. Hoarding food, violating essential hunting taboos, or refusing to share resources were capital crimes in a subsistence economy. Homicide was the ultimate transgression, not only for the loss of a community member, but because it invariably triggered the obligation of blood revenge. The victim's kin were bound by custom to retaliate, creating a cycle of violence that could annihilate entire family groups. To prevent this, a homicide was treated as a community crisis. Sometimes, the killer would publicly offer themselves to the victim's family to be executed, a final act to restore balance. In other cases, if an individual proved to be a persistent danger, a repeat murderer, or a malicious sorcerer, the community itself would reach a consensus to eliminate them. This was not a state execution but a collective act of social preservation, often carried out by the offender's own closest relative to preempt the start of a blood feud. Around the turn of the first millennium, a new people arrived on the eastern edge of the Inuit and Yupik world. The Icelandic sagas, specifically the saga of the Greenlanders and Eric the Red's saga, document the westward expansion of Norse settlers, first to Greenland around 985 CE, and subsequently to the coast of North America, which they called Vinland. The sagas refer to all the indigenous peoples they met in these new lands, with the single exonym, Skraling. In Greenland, these encounters were initially with the last remnants of the Dorset culture, and, in later centuries, with the advancing Thule Inuit. In Vinland, the Norse met ancestors of First Nations peoples, but the saga accounts often blend these distinct groups into a single archetype. These narratives, corroborated by archaeology, represent the first documented contact between Europeans and the indigenous populations of the Americas. The initial interactions were centered on trade. The Norse possessed goods entirely outside the material culture of the Arctic peoples: iron tools, woven woolen cloth, and dairy products. In return, the Skrallings offered furs, hides, and walrus ivory. The sagas describe a mutual curiosity, but also a profound technological and cultural gap. The Norse had iron metallurgy, large ocean-going ships, and livestock. The indigenous populations had a highly adapted non-metallic toolkit. This disparity created immediate tension. One saga recounts how a Skralling was killed after attempting to take an iron axe, an object of immense value and power. His companions showed astonishment at the weapon's effectiveness, a stark illustration of the technological imbalance. These tentative commercial exchanges quickly deteriorated into conflict. The Norse, few in number, perceived the indigenous populations as a significant threat. The sagas describe battles in which the Skrælings used their numerical superiority and projectile weapons with considerable effect. The accounts mention showers of arrows and stones, some possibly launched from sling-like devices, which overwhelmed the Norse colonists. Despite their iron armor and weaponry, the sagas are clear that the Norse felt their position was untenable. The constant hostility of a much larger native population was a primary factor in the decision to abandon the Vinland settlement after only a few years. Archaeological evidence from the Norse site at Lanso Meadows in Newfoundland confirms this presence and interaction. While direct evidence of conflict is scarce, the discovery of Norse artifacts, such as a spindle whorl and iron rivets, proves their settlement. More telling are finds in indigenous contexts across the eastern Arctic and Greenland, where small pieces of smelted metal and fragments of woven cloth have been found, materials that could only have been sourced from the Norse. This material record confirms that the encounters described in the sagas were not literary invention, but a historical reality, a fleeting but momentous meeting of two worlds that had developed in isolation for millennia. The Norse presence in Greenland, initiated by Eric the Red, endured for nearly 5 centuries, a testament to European tenacity at the edge of the known world. Yet, by the mid-15th century, this foothold had vanished. The collapse was not a single catastrophic event, but a gradual demographic decline culminating in abandonment and extinction, driven by a confluence of environmental, economic, and cultural factors. The society comprised 2 main enclaves, the larger eastern settlement and the more northerly western settlement, both of which were structured around a fundamentally European model of pastoral farming. This agricultural identity, a source of cultural pride, would ultimately prove to be a fatal vulnerability when confronted with a changing Arctic. The primary catalyst for the decline was climatic. The Norse colonization had coincided with the medieval warm period, a time of relatively mild conditions that made their livestock-based economy viable. However, beginning in the 14th century, the North Atlantic entered the Little Ice Age. The effects in Greenland were severe. Average temperatures dropped, shortening the already brief growing season for the hay needed to overwinter cattle and sheep. More critically, the expansion of sea ice, or storis, choked the fjords for longer periods each year. This ice had a dual impact. It made the perilous sea voyage to and from Europe increasingly difficult, strangling trade, and it disrupted the habitat of the harbour, and harp seals the Norse traditionally hunted from their heavy boats in open water. This environmental shift was compounded by a profound cultural conservatism. Faced with a cooling world and failing farms, the Norse proved remarkably resistant to adopting the superior Arctic survival technologies of their Thule Inuit neighbours. Archaeological analysis of Norse middens shows a desperate dietary shift towards marine resources, but their methods were inefficient. They never adopted the toggling harpoon, the kayak for individual hunting, or the umiak for whaling the pillars of the Thule subsistence economy. This technological stasis appears rooted in a rigid cultural identity. As European Christians, they saw the Inuit as pagan Skrælings, competitors for resources rather than models for adaptation. This refusal to learn sealed their inability to effectively hunt the ringed seal, the one mammal that thrived in the expanding sea ice. Finally, the colony's economic lifeline to Europe frayed and then snapped. The primary export that made Greenland viable was walrus ivory, a luxury good prized in Europe. By the 14th century, the market for this ivory collapsed due to competition from cheaper Russian sources and the opening of new trade routes. With their main export worthless and the sea lanes increasingly blocked by ice, the vital trade for iron, timber, and grain ceased. The western settlement was abandoned around 1350. The eastern settlement held on, with the last written record being a marriage certificate from 1408. After that, there is only silence. The Norse did not leave. They slowly starved. Succumbing to a changing world they refused to fully embrace. The centuries of relative isolation for the Inuit and Yupik peoples came to an abrupt end with the arrival of European and American commercial whaling fleets, beginning in the 17th century and escalating dramatically in the 19th. These were not the tentative explorations of the Norse, they were industrial-scale operations. Massive three-masted sailing ships, floating factories crewed by hundreds of men, began to systematically exploit the Arctic's marine bounty. The primary target was the bowhead whale, the same animal that formed the cornerstone of the Thule subsistence economy. The whalers' objective, however, was not sustenance but profit, driven by a global demand for whale oil to illuminate cities and baleen to structure fashionable clothing. This commercial enterprise would irrevocably alter the economy, technology, and social fabric of the Arctic. The initial relationship was one of economic exchange. The whalers recognized the unparalleled expertise of the Inuit hunters. Possessing skills honed over generations, the Inuit were masters of reading sea ice, tracking marine mammals, and handling small watercraft in treacherous conditions. They were soon employed as pilots, harpooners, and guides, incorporated into the global cash economy for the first time. In exchange for their labor and the trade of furs and ivory, the Inuit received a flood of new materials. Iron pots replaced soapstone, steel knives rendered the ulu obsolete for many tasks, and woven textiles began to supplement traditional skin clothing. Most transformative was the firearm. The rifle offered a range and killing power that far surpassed traditional hunting tools, dramatically increasing the efficiency of the hunt for caribou and other game. This new material wealth, however, came at a staggering cost. The introduction of these goods created a cycle of dependency. As firearms replaced bows, the skills needed to create and maintain traditional weapons atrophied. The very success of the commercial hunt, which brought these new goods, was also destroying the foundation of the old economy. The industrial efficiency of the commercial whalers led to a catastrophic depletion of the bowhead whale population. Within a few generations, the animal that had sustained large Arctic communities for a millennium became scarce, triggering widespread food insecurity and famine in regions dependent upon it. The social disruption was equally profound. Traditional sharing networks, which ensured the survival of the entire community, were eroded by the new logic of wages and individual accumulation of goods. The authority of elders and the spiritual guidance of the Angakok were challenged by the material power offered by the whalers. Furthermore, the whaling ships carried unseen cargo, infectious diseases like measles, influenza, and tuberculosis, to which the indigenous populations had no immunity. Epidemics swept through coastal communities, causing demographic collapse and the loss of entire generations of cultural knowledge. The whalers' ships brought a new world, but in doing so, they shattered the old one. The introduction of European goods represented more than a simple exchange. It was the abrupt arrival of an Iron Age into a sophisticated Neolithic world. The transformation was driven by the inherent superiority of metal over stone, bone, and ivory for specific applications. A steel saw could shape a driftwood sled runner in a fraction of the time it took to adze one with a stone tool. Metal files allowed for a precision in shaping bone and ivory harpoon heads that was previously unattainable. Drills with metal bits streamlined the construction of kayak frames and other complex wooden structures. This technological influx was not an evolution, but a substitution, and it initiated an irreversible process of material culture change. The trade itself was complex, establishing for the first time a direct link between the Arctic subsistence economy and the global commodity market. The Hudson's Bay Company and other trading posts institutionalized this relationship, creating a standardized system of barter. The value of a prime Arctic fox pelt, for instance, was calculated in made beaver, the de facto currency of the fur trade, which could then be exchanged for a set quantity of goods, a certain number of lead balls and a measure of gunpowder, a specific weight of tobacco, or a length of woolen cloth. This system imposed an external, abstract value on local resources, fundamentally altering the Inuit and Yupik relationship with the animals they hunted. The purpose of the hunt was no longer solely for sustenance and raw materials, but for acquiring a surplus to trade for necessities that were now manufactured elsewhere. This new economy triggered a rapid atrophy of traditional skills. The intricate knowledge of selecting and napping chert for a blade, a process requiring years of apprenticeship, became redundant in the face of a cheap, durable steel knife. The painstaking process of carving a functional cooking pot from soapstone was abandoned for the efficiency of a lightweight iron vessel. This was not a failure of culture, but a pragmatic adoption of superior technology. The consequence, however, was a break in the generational transmission of knowledge. Within a few generations, the ability to produce a complete, non-metallic toolkit, the very foundation of Arctic survival for 4 millennia, was lost in many regions. This technological dependency created a new form of vulnerability. A hunter with a rifle was far more effective than one with a bow, but his effectiveness was entirely contingent on a steady supply of ammunition from a distant trading post. A disruption in that supply chain, whether due to bad weather preventing a ship's arrival or a shift in global trade, could render his primary hunting tool useless. The self-sufficiency that had been the hallmark of Arctic life was traded for a new efficiency, but at the cost of an irreversible entanglement with an outside world over which the Inuit and Yupik had no control. The most devastating cargo carried by European ships was biological and invisible. For millennia, the geographic isolation of the Arctic had protected its inhabitants from the dense catalogue of pathogens that had evolved in the agricultural societies of the Old World. The arrival of whalers, traders, and explorers initiated a series of virgin soil epidemics, introducing diseases to which the Inuit and Yupik had no acquired immunity. The results were catastrophic. Viruses such as measles and influenza, and bacteria causing tuberculosis and scarlet fever, swept through communities with an intensity unimaginable in Europe. Mortality rates in initial outbreaks often exceeded 50%, and in some localized epidemics approached 90%. Entire family groups and seasonal settlements were wiped out, severing kinship lines and erasing vast repositories of oral history and traditional knowledge embodied by the elders who were often the most vulnerable. This demographic collapse precipitated a profound spiritual crisis. The traditional cosmological framework, in which the Angakuku served as the vital intermediary with the spirit world, was predicated on an ability to diagnose and heal afflictions. Shamanic practices, effective for treating injuries or psychosomatic illnesses within their own cultural context, were powerless against these new microbial invaders. The failure of traditional healing rituals to save the sick, especially children and respected elders, created a theological vacuum. The established order, where balance with the spirit world ensured health and prosperity, appeared to have failed. It was into this environment of profound loss and spiritual uncertainty that Christian missionaries arrived. Groups like the Moravians in Labrador, and later Anglican and Catholic missions across the Arctic, brought a new and comprehensive worldview. They offered not only a different cosmology, but also, crucially, an explanation for the suffering that was consuming communities. The Christian narrative of sin, suffering, and redemption provided a framework for understanding the inexplicable devastation. The missionaries' access to rudimentary Western medicine, which in some cases offered limited relief where traditional methods failed, further bolstered their perceived spiritual power. The process of conversion was often gradual and pragmatic, as individuals and families sought access to the spiritual and material resources the missions offered. To facilitate this conversion, missionaries undertook the monumental task of translating the Bible into indigenous languages. In the Canadian Arctic, this led to the development of Inuktitut syllabics, a writing system adapted by missionaries in the 1870s that allowed for widespread literacy in a remarkably short time. This act had a dual legacy. It was an effective tool of Christian evangelization, but it also provided the Inuit with a powerful medium for preserving their own language. The mission stations themselves became focal points on the landscape, offering not just religious services but also rudimentary schooling and healthcare, drawing nomadic families into increasingly permanent settlements, and further accelerating the monumental changes to their way of life. The formal imposition of European sovereignty in the Arctic began not as a planned imperial conquest, but as the private obsession of a Dano-Norwegian Lutheran missionary named Hans Egede. His primary motivation, developed in the early 18th century, was rooted in a historical misapprehension. He believed the descendants of the vanished Norse colonies in Greenland still survived, and he was driven by a desire to find these lost kin and reconvert them from their presumed Catholicism to the Protestant faith. After years of lobbying, he secured a royal charter from King Frederick IV of Denmark-Norway. But the Crown's interest was as much economic as it was theological. The venture was structured as a joint stock enterprise, the Bergen Greenland Company, which was granted a trade monopoly, intertwining Egede's religious mission with the state's colonial and commercial ambitions from its inception. Upon his arrival in 1721, Egede's quest to find Norse survivors met with immediate failure. Instead of Viking longhouses, he found only the Kalaallit Inuit. This discovery fundamentally pivoted his mission's objective from reconversion to the primary Christianization of a people whose spiritual and social systems were entirely unknown to him. He established a permanent settlement near a large Inuit encampment, naming it Godhope, or Good Hope, the future site of Nuuk. This was not merely a mission station but a colonial beachhead, consisting of a dwelling house, a trading post, and a church, the triad of institutions that would define Danish rule for the next 200 years. The trading operation, which would later be formalized as the Royal Greenland Trading Department, KGH, became the instrument of economic control, monopolizing the exchange of European goods for local products like sealskin and blubber. Egede's approach was methodical. He dedicated himself to learning the complex Greenlandic language, a formidable task that was essential for his work of translating catechisms and scripture. However, his attempts to convey abstract Lutheran doctrines often resulted in profound cultural misunderstandings. Concepts like sin and divine grace had no direct equivalent in the Inuit worldview, which was based on maintaining practical harmony with the spirit world. While some Inuit were drawn to the material advantages and perceived power of the newcomers, many resisted the imposition of a foreign faith that seemed disconnected from the realities of Arctic survival. The most lasting impact of Egede's enterprise was the establishment of a permanent, state-sanctioned colonial presence. The trading posts became gravitational centers, encouraging the previously nomadic Inuit to settle in more permanent communities to gain access to trade goods and missionary services. This sedentarization fundamentally disrupted traditional seasonal migration patterns, altered subsistence strategies, and began a long process of economic dependency and cultural assimilation under Danish colonial administration, a system that would govern Greenland until the mid-20th century. In stark contrast to the state-sponsored colonialism of Greenland, a different model of European contact unfolded on the coast of Labrador, driven by the German-speaking missionaries of the Moravian Church. Emerging from a pietist tradition, the Moravians' objective was not imperial expansion, but the creation of self-sufficient, all-encompassing Christian communities, insulated from what they viewed as the corrupting influences of the outside world. Their first permanent mission was established at Nain in 1771, followed by Okak and Hopedale, each meticulously planned as a spiritual and economic enclave intended to completely reshape Inuit life. This was not a system of scattered trading posts, but the deliberate construction of theocratic settlements. The core of the Moravian system was the mission store, an institution that functioned as the sole economic interface between the Inuit and the European world. Unlike the monopolistic but commercially driven Royal Greenland Trading Department, the Moravian store was an instrument of social and religious policy. Its purpose was to achieve economic self-sufficiency for the mission, while carefully controlling the flow of goods to the Inuit population. The missionaries regulated access to firearms, ammunition, and imported foods, using economic leverage to enforce adherence to Christian doctrine and a settled lifestyle. This paternalistic model was explicitly designed to shield the Inuit from the vices, particularly alcohol, that were rampant in the unregulated trade with transient European fishermen and whalers. Life in the Moravian settlements was highly structured and communal. The physical layout of Nain or Okak reflected this ideology, with Inuit families encouraged to build permanent wooden houses in an orderly arrangement around the central church, mission house, and store. This design intentionally disrupted the fluid, seasonal mobility that had defined Inuit society. Acceptance into the community required a formal conversion to Christianity and submission to the authority of the missionaries, who governed nearly every aspect of daily existence, from marital practices to hunting schedules. The system created a sedentary population wholly dependent on the mission for both its spiritual and material needs. The cultural impact of the Moravians was profound and distinctive. They were meticulous linguists, undertaking extensive work to document the Labrador dialect of Inuktitut, producing comprehensive grammars and dictionaries that remain valuable today. They were also patrons of a unique musical tradition, introducing brass instruments and polyphonic choral singing. This music became deeply ingrained in Labrador Inuit culture, a lasting legacy of the Moravian presence. This remarkable cultural work, however, was inseparable from the rigid social control of the mission system, which succeeded in preserving the Inuit language, while simultaneously dismantling the autonomy and nomadic traditions that had sustained its speakers for centuries. While commercial whaling had introduced a disruptive seasonal economy, the systematic expansion of the Hudson's Bay Company into the Arctic interior and coastline during the late 19th and early 20th centuries imposed a more permanent and transformative economic order. Unlike the transient whaling ships, the HBC established a network of fixed trading posts, physical outposts of a global commodities market that became permanent fixtures on the landscape. This arrival marked a fundamental reorientation of the indigenous economy, away from a purely subsistence-based model toward one increasingly integrated with, and dependent upon, the international fur market. The primary commodity sought by the HBC in the high Arctic was not the beaver pelt of the subarctic, but the pristine white pelt of the Arctic fox, a resource that previously held minimal economic value in traditional Inuit society. This new economic imperative fundamentally altered long-established patterns of land use and social organization. The traditional hunt, a communal activity governed by seasonal cycles and intricate sharing customs, was supplemented, and in many cases supplanted by the solitary, individualistic practice of running a trapline. Success was no longer measured solely by the ability to provide for one's kin group, but by the quantity of pelts that could be exchanged at the post. The HBC introduced a system of credit, or debt, where hunters were advanced supplies rifles, steel traps, tea, sugar, and flour against the promise of future furs. This system created a powerful new dependency and established the post manager, or factor, as a figure of immense local authority capable of determining a family's economic well-being through his control over trade goods. The technology acquired through this trade had immediate and irreversible effects on subsistence practices. The widespread adoption of the high-powered rifle made hunting large game like caribou and seals more efficient, but also led to localized depletion of animal populations. Steel traps allowed for the harvesting of fur-bearers on an industrial scale, but they were indiscriminate and disrupted the intimate ecological knowledge that underpinned older, more sustainable hunting methods. The entire material culture began to shift as families became reliant on imported canvas for tents, metal pots for cooking, and kerosene for lamps, gradually displacing skills in working with skin, bone, and stone that had been honed over millennia. This economic enmeshment tethered previously mobile family groups to the vicinity of the trading post, disrupting nomadic cycles and laying the groundwork for the permanent settlements that would come to define the modern Arctic. The European quest for a northern sea route to Asia, a geopolitical ambition dating back to the 16th century, superimposed a foreign geography of passages and straits onto a landscape that was, for the Inuit, a fully realized and intricately known homeland. The initial forays, such as Martin Frobisher's 3 expeditions to Baffin Island between 1000 1576 and 1578, were not missions of discovery, but of violent intrusion. Frobisher's interactions were characterized by immediate conflict and misunderstanding. His men kidnapped an Inuk man, and in turn, 5 of his own sailors were captured, never to be seen again. The entire enterprise was fueled by a profound economic delusion, the belief that the black rock he brought back to England contained gold, which led to a massive, futile mining operation. For the Inuit, these first encounters were with men who sought wealth in worthless stone and demonstrated a dangerous unpredictability. This pattern of transient, often hostile contact continued for centuries, but intensified dramatically in the 19th century with the British Royal Navy's systematic and heavily capitalized search. The most consequential of these was the expedition led by Sir John Franklin, which sailed from England in 1845. Franklin's 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, were marvels of British industrial technology, equipped with steam engines and tinned provisions for a multi-year voyage. This technological self-assurance proved fatal. The expedition adhered to a rigid military hierarchy and a European logic of exploration that was completely at odds with the fluid, adaptive strategies required for Arctic survival. When the ships became beset in the ice near King William Island in 1846, this rigid system collapsed catastrophically. The true fate of the 129 crew members was preserved not in British Admiralty logs, but in the oral histories of the Netsilik Inuit. For years, they recounted stories of seeing desperate, starving white men trekking south, and of discovering camps littered with evidence of cannibalism. These accounts, meticulously reported to the Hudson's Bay Company by John Ray in 1854, were initially dismissed by British society, which refused to accept such a grim end for its national heroes. It was Inuit testimony, however, that ultimately guided searchers to the wreckage and remains. The decades-long search for Franklin, involving dozens of naval and private expeditions, resulted in the comprehensive charting of the Canadian archipelago. In the process of searching for their own lost men, European powers mapped, named, and claimed Inuit lands, asserting a sovereignty that disregarded millennia of prior occupation and profound indigenous geographical knowledge. The transition from intermittent contact to permanent cohabitation marked the most fundamental social restructuring in Arctic history. The Inuktitut term for non-Inuit, kalunat, originally a descriptor for visitors, now came to signify a permanent, resident population of outsiders who brought with them entirely new structures of power and authority. This was no longer about seasonal trade or passing expeditions. It was the establishment of a year-round colonial infrastructure. Beginning in the early 20th century, the familiar figures of the trader and the missionary were joined by a new class of kalunat, the constable of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the government administrator, and eventually the federal school teacher and nurse. Their arrival signaled the end of Inuit autonomy and the beginning of direct governance by a distant southern state. The establishment of RCMP detachments was a critical turning point. These small, isolated barracks were not built for commerce, but for the imposition of Canadian sovereignty and law. For the first time, Inuit customary law, which had effectively maintained social harmony through community-based sanctions and restorative justice for millennia, was now subordinate to an alien legal code. RCMP officers, often young men with little understanding of the culture or language, were tasked with enforcing laws concerning everything from murder to dog management. The introduction of this external legal system created profound confusion and conflict, as actions permissible or resolvable within one cultural framework were now criminal offences in another. This assertion of state control was not symbolic. It was enforced through arrests, trials in distant courts, and imprisonment, fundamentally dismantling traditional modes of conflict resolution. Simultaneously, the permanent presence of administrators from the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development introduced a bureaucratic layer of governance. These agents oversaw the distribution of family allowances and other forms of government relief, creating a new and powerful dependency, that tied Inuit families to specific settlements. This process of sedentarization was accelerated as the government began to view the nomadic lifestyle as inefficient and incompatible with the delivery of state services like healthcare and education. The world of the Kalunat was one of fixed schedules, written records, and hierarchical authority, concepts that stood in stark contrast to the fluid, kinship-based, and consensus-driven nature of traditional Inuit society. Adjusting to this permanent presence required navigating a complex and often contradictory new reality, where the rhythms of the seasons were increasingly governed by the bureaucratic calendar of the southern state. The concept of the nation-state, defined by fixed and defended borders, was a European abstraction utterly alien to the Inuit worldview, which understood territory through kinship, seasonal use, and ecological continuity. For millennia, the Arctic had been a borderless commons, a cohesive homeland known as Inuit Nunat, where movement was dictated by the migration of game, not the treaties of distant empires. The imposition of international boundaries during the 19th and 20th centuries represented a profound cartographic violence, dissecting this homeland with arbitrary lines that severed ancient social and economic networks. The 1867 Alaska Purchase, where the Russian Empire sold its North American territories to the United States, established one such line along the 141st meridian west. This geometric abstraction, drawn without any consultation or even awareness of the region's inhabitants, cut directly through the traditional territories of the Inupiat and Gwich'in, instantly transforming kin on one side into Canadians and on the other into Americans. Nowhere was this division more absolute than across the Bering Strait. This narrow channel of water had never been a barrier. It was a maritime highway connecting the Yupik peoples of Siberia with their relatives in Alaska. For thousands of years, families had crossed in umiaks for trade, social gatherings, and marriage alliances. The establishment of a formal border between the United States and the Russian Empire began to restrict this fluid movement, but it was the Cold War that lowered an ice curtain, transforming the strait into one of the most heavily militarized and impermeable frontiers on the planet. Families were permanently separated, their connections severed for generations. A journey that was once a routine part of seasonal life became an act of international espionage, effectively ending millennia of transcontinental kinship. A similar, though less militarized, division occurred between Canada and Greenland. The maritime boundary drawn through the Davis Strait and Baffin Bay formalized the separation between Canadian Inuit and the Kalaallit of Greenland, peoples who shared a common Thule ancestry and linguistic roots. This imposition of national sovereignty redefined ancient relationships in terms of state citizenship. People who were once part of a single circumpolar cultural continuum were now subject to the distinct laws, economic policies, and political systems of the United States, Canada, Denmark, and the Soviet Union. Traditional mobility, the very foundation of Arctic survival and social cohesion, was now reframed as international travel, subject to regulation, restriction, and in many cases, complete prohibition, fundamentally fracturing the unity of the Inuit world. The establishment of residential and federal day schools across the Arctic in the 20th century was not an educational initiative in the modern sense. It was a state-sponsored program of systematic cultural assimilation, operated by religious organizations on behalf of the Canadian and American governments. These institutions were designed with the explicit goal of eradicating indigenous cultures and languages to absorb Inuit and Yupik children into the dominant Euro-American society. The residential school system was particularly devastating, as it required the mandatory removal of children from their families and communities for most of the year. This physical separation was a core component of the assimilationist policy, deliberately engineered to sever the transmission of traditional knowledge, kinship ties, and cultural identity from one generation to the next. Upon arrival, children were subjected to a totalizing regime designed to strip them of their heritage. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages, such as Inuktitut or Yupik, and were often severely punished for doing so. Their traditional skin clothing was replaced with institutional uniforms, and their given names were often supplanted by European names, or in some cases, identification numbers. The curriculum ignored indigenous knowledge systems entirely, instead teaching subjects from a southern colonial perspective that often denigrated their own culture as primitive or savage. The skills taught were intended to prepare them for a life of manual labor in the southern economy, not for a successful existence in their home territories. The conditions within these schools were frequently appalling. Overcrowding and poor sanitation were rampant, and diets consisted of unfamiliar, low-quality food that led to widespread malnutrition. These factors, combined with inadequate medical care, created an environment where diseases like tuberculosis and influenza spread with lethal efficiency, resulting in mortality rates that were orders of magnitude higher than in the general population. Beyond the physical neglect, the system was rife with abuse. Testimonies from survivors document pervasive physical, emotional, and sexual abuse at the hands of school staff. The long-term consequences of this system constituted a profound cultural trauma. Children returned to their communities as strangers, alienated from their families, unable to speak their own language fluently, and lacking the essential skills for subsistence hunting and survival. The schools created a rupture that has manifested in generations of social dislocation, loss of language, and a painful legacy that communities are still working to overcome. The mid-20th century witnessed a deliberate and systematic campaign by colonial governments to end the nomadic cycle that had defined Inuit and Yupik existence for millennia. This policy of sedentarization was driven by a southern bureaucratic desire for administrative efficiency, social control, and the belief that a migratory lifestyle was an impediment to progress. The primary tool of this policy was the construction of permanent settlements, clusters of prefabricated, southern-style houses erected in locations chosen by government planners, often with little regard for traditional land use or local ecology. These settlements were not organic developments but artificial creations, designed to concentrate dispersed populations into manageable administrative units. Families were encouraged, and in some cases coerced, to abandon their seasonal camps and move into these government houses, a transition that fundamentally severed their direct, daily connection to the land. This shift was cemented by the strategic centralization of all essential services. To receive healthcare from a nursing station, to send a child to school, or to collect a family allowance check, one had to reside in the settlement. This created a powerful dependency, transforming self-reliant family groups into a population reliant on state infrastructure. The very architecture of life changed. The igloo and sod house, perfectly adapted to the environment, were replaced by poorly insulated wooden houses that were expensive to heat and ill-suited for processing country food. The spatial organization of the settlements also disrupted social norms, forcing unrelated families into close quarters, which undermined traditional kinship-based support systems and created new social tensions. The consequences of this forced sedentarization were immediate and catastrophic. The most profound impact was on health, as the move away from a nutrient-rich traditional diet of wild game and fish to a reliance on processed, high-carbohydrate store-bought foods precipitated a public health crisis. Rates of diet-related illnesses such as diabetes, obesity, and heart disease, previously non-existent, skyrocketed within a single generation. Furthermore, the cessation of the nomadic cycle created a profound crisis of knowledge. Children growing up in settlements were no longer immersed in the environment where land-based skills were learned. The intricate knowledge of animal behavior, sea ice navigation, and traditional tool-making began to atrophy, breaking the chain of cultural transmission that had ensured survival for thousands of years. The end of the nomadic cycle was not merely a change in residence. It was the dismantling of an entire economic, social, and epistemological world. The geopolitical tensions of the Cold War transformed the Arctic from a remote homeland into a strategic military frontier. For the United States and the Soviet Union, the shortest flight path for intercontinental bombers and missiles lay directly over the polar region, turning the vast northern territories into a critical buffer zone. This new strategic reality prompted an unprecedented militarization of the North, driven by external anxieties that paid little heed to the region's inhabitants. The most significant manifestation of this was the Distant Early Warning Line, or DEW line, a joint US-Canadian project initiated in the 1950s. This immense undertaking involved the construction of a chain of over 60 radar stations stretching approximately 800 kilometers across the Arctic, from Alaska to Greenland. Its sole purpose was to detect incoming Soviet bombers and provide minutes of advance warning for a North American response. The construction was a monumental logistical feat, requiring thousands of Southern personnel and the transportation of immense quantities of equipment and prefabricated materials into some of the world's most inaccessible terrain. For the Inuit, the DEW line represented an invasion of technology and Southern personnel on a scale never before witnessed, introducing wage labor on a widespread basis and creating a new economic dependency that further eroded traditional subsistence patterns. Concurrent with the DEW line's construction, the Canadian government undertook an action to assert its sovereignty over the sparsely populated Queen Elizabeth Islands. This geopolitical ambition, fueled by Cold War anxieties about control of the archipelago, resulted in the high Arctic relocation. In 1953 and 1955, the government moved several Inuit families from Inukuak in northern Quebec and Pond Inlet to the far northern and previously uninhabited locations of Grise Fiord and Resolute Bay. The official rationale was humanitarian. The government claimed it was relocating the families to areas with more abundant game to alleviate resource pressures in their home communities. The reality was a poorly planned and executed social experiment. The families were transported to an ecosystem that was profoundly different and significantly harsher than their own, with a much colder climate, different animal migration patterns, and months of total winter darkness they were unaccustomed to. Promised support and housing were inadequate or failed to materialize, and the families were left to fend for themselves, facing starvation and extreme hardship. The government's promise that they could return home after a few years if they were unhappy was broken. The relocations are now understood not as a humanitarian act, but as the use of human beings as flagpoles to bolster Canadian territorial claims, a forced migration that inflicted deep and lasting trauma on the individuals and their descendants. The discovery of massive oil reserves at Prudhoe Bay in 1968 acted as the catalyst for the most significant piece of Indigenous rights legislation in United States history. The proposed Trans-Alaska Pipeline system, essential for transporting the oil, could not proceed while the Aboriginal land title of Alaska Natives remained unresolved, creating an impassable legal barrier for both the state and oil corporations. This economic imperative forced the federal government to confront a century of neglected land claims. In response, Yupik, Inuit, and other indigenous groups organized with unprecedented unity, forming the Alaska Federation of Natives to lobby for a comprehensive settlement. The result of this intense political negotiation was the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, or ANCSA, signed into law by President Richard Nixon in December 1971. The act was a radical departure from all previous federal Indian policy. ANCSA extinguished all Aboriginal land claims and traditional hunting and fishing rights across the state. In exchange for this complete cession of title, the Act transferred approximately 44 million acres of land and provided a monetary settlement of $962.5 million. The most revolutionary and controversial aspect of ANCSA was its mechanism for distributing these assets. Instead of vesting ownership in tribal governments, as had been the model elsewhere, the Act mandated the creation of a complex, tiered system of for-profit corporations. 12 regional corporations were established based on geographic and cultural affinities, with a 13th created later for non-resident Alaska Natives. Beneath them, over 200 village corporations were formed, corresponding to individual communities. Every eligible Alaska Native enrolled under the Act became a shareholder, receiving 100 shares in their respective regional and, if applicable, village corporation. This corporate model was designed to integrate Alaska Natives into the American capitalist system, providing the tools for economic development and self-sufficiency. The corporations were immediately tasked with managing their land and monetary assets, investing in business ventures that ranged from resource extraction and construction to government contracting and tourism. The initial legislation placed a 20-year restriction on the sale of stock to non-natives to prevent the rapid loss of the land base. While ANCSA provided a new framework for economic power and a degree of self-determination, it also fundamentally altered the relationship between people and their ancestral lands, transforming it from one of direct stewardship and subsistence use to one of corporate ownership and shareholder interest. This unprecedented experiment in corporate tribalism created a new class of powerful native institutions, but also generated complex internal debates about the balance between profitability and the preservation of cultural values. The decades following the Second World War initiated a profound shift in the political status of Greenland and its relationship with Denmark. The constitutional reform of 1953 formally ended Greenland's colonial status, transforming it into an integrated county of the Danish kingdom. While intended as a modernizing step, this integration accelerated a top-down policy of Danicization, where Danish language, administration, and social norms were promoted to develop Greenland in Denmark's image. This state-led modernization, however, fostered a new generation of educated Greenlanders who became increasingly critical of Danish paternalism and the social ills, such as alcoholism and cultural dislocation, that accompanied the rapid transition to settlement life. A distinct political consciousness began to coalesce during the 1960s and 1970s, fueled by a desire to reclaim control over Greenland's internal affairs. This growing sentiment for self-determination crystallized with the formation of Greenland's first political parties. Parties like Siumut, founded in the mid-1970s, articulated a clear platform for autonomy, demanding that decisions affecting Greenlanders be made in Greenland. The movement gained significant momentum over the issue of natural resources. The prospect of oil and mineral wealth in Greenlandic territory brought the question of ownership to the forefront. Greenlanders argued that the island's subsurface resources should benefit its own population, not the Danish state. Another major catalyst was Denmark's entry into the European Economic Community in 1973, a decision made in Copenhagen but which directly impacted Greenlandic fisheries, the cornerstone of the local economy. The feeling that external forces were dictating Greenland's future became a powerful unifying grievance. In response to this sustained political pressure, a joint Danish-Greenlandic Home Rule Commission was established in 1975 to draft a framework for self-governance. The Commission's work culminated in a referendum held in Greenland on January 17, 1979. The result was an overwhelming mandate for change, with 70.1% of voters supporting the implementation of Home Rule. The subsequent Greenland Home Rule Act, which came into effect on May 1, 1979, was a landmark achievement in decolonization. It established a new Greenlandic parliament, the Landsting, and a government, the Landstyre, based in Nuuk. Authority over critical domestic sectors including fisheries, healthcare, education, and social services was officially transferred from Danish to Greenlandic control. While Denmark retained sovereignty and responsibility for foreign policy, defence and currency, the Act marked the formal end of direct rule from Copenhagen and the beginning. The movement towards Inuit self-governance in Canada followed a path fundamentally different from those in Alaska or Greenland, culminating not in a corporate structure or home rule under a unitary state, but in the creation of an entirely new territory. This process was the result of decades of persistent and sophisticated political negotiation, initiated by Inuit leaders in the late 1960s and early 1970s. 1970s. Organizations like the Inuit Taparisat of Canada, founded in 1971, were established to represent Inuit interests at a national level. From the outset, their primary goal was a comprehensive land claim settlement that would be inextricably linked to the creation of a new political jurisdiction, carved from the eastern and central portions of the Northwest Territories, where Inuit constituted the demographic majority. This vision was for a public government available to all residents, but one whose institutions, language, and priorities would be shaped by Inuit culture. The first formal proposal for Nunavut, meaning our land in Inuktitut, was submitted to the federal government in 1976. This began a long and arduous negotiation process that spanned 16 years. A critical milestone was reached in a 1982 plebiscite held across the Northwest Territories, in which a majority of residents voted in favor of dividing the territory. This public mandate gave crucial momentum to the negotiations for what would become the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement. This agreement, unlike its Alaskan counterpart, was not primarily a corporate settlement. Instead, it focused on defining land title and resource rights. After years of detailed mapping and negotiation, the final agreement was reached, representing the largest Indigenous land claims settlement in Canadian history. The Nunavut Land Claims Agreement, signed in 1993, is a complex legal document that provided the Inuit of Nunavut with fee simple title to approximately 350 square kilometers of land, including mineral rights to a portion of that area. It also included a capital transfer of over 1 billion Canadian dollars paid out over 14 years, and established a series of co-management boards for wildlife, resource management, and environmental protection, guaranteeing Inuit a direct role in governing the land and waters. In parallel with the land claim, the Canadian Parliament passed the Nunavut Act in 1993, which legally established the framework for the new territory and set a firm date for its creation. On April 1, 1999, the map of Canada was officially redrawn. The territory of Nunavut came into legal existence, with its own legislative assembly and public government based in the newly designated capital of Iqaluit. It was a landmark achievement, establishing a public government within the Canadian Federation that was, by design, an expression of Indigenous self-determination.